Don't be afraid, little ones. Today's background footage is just me playing my dark fantasy game I made. It does not affect the story whatsoever. Enjoy, and if you want to play the game yourself, check the links in the description.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
As a modern man living in the suburbs now, DoorDash has become one of my crutches. Or is it a vice? Too tired to make lunch? DoorDash. Need that 200-calorie latte that you can't live without, with a 40% chance of it tasting like water? DoorDash. This leads me to today's story, titled Confessions of a Missouri DoorDasher, from someone with the username simply Missouri Misery. This story is a set of stories from the same person, cataloging his most weird and scary experiences while working with DoorDash. Is this story actually true? Well, that's up for you to decide. These are tales from the break room. If you're listening on YouTube, you should be listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Just search for Tales from the Break Room. I'm a food delivery driver. That is my choice of career, I guess. DoorDash mostly, but I do some Uber Eats when DoorDash is slow. I used to work for UPS, but got laid off. That happened a few years ago. So I started dashing to cover a couple months of bills. But then those couple of months just never ended. Now it's my job. I'm 27 years old, working out of a mid-sized town in southwest Missouri. I'm about an hour away from a Bass Pro, and there's like 40 churches per square mile here, if that narrows it down without giving it dead away. To describe part of the job that people don't really think about, I go to strangers' houses all night. Of course, that is the job. 15 to 20 houses a night, most of which are after dark, because I get my best tips at night. But as I was saying, that thing that people don't think about when it comes to delivery drivers like us is that we see a moment of people's lives that happens right at their front door. Most of that is boring. Just porch lights and a guy in basketball shorts saying, "Appreciate you, man." But it's just enough for you to get a feel for that person and how they are. At least a little bit. But the app doesn't care where the house is. My zone covers the town plus a big ring of country around it. And out here the country gets country real fast. Missouri is like that, where the little roads have letters instead of names. Route J, Highway ZZ, and stuff like that. And some of those letter roads go way back up into the hills. The app will send you right up in them too at 1 a.m. to bring somebody a milkshake. And you go, because that's 11 easy bucks. Also, this matters for a couple of these. Most deliveries are now no contact. Leave it at the door, take a photo, walk away. Most everyone I deliver to prefers it that way nowadays. No more human contact. That's old news. So most of my customers I never see at all. There is a notes field where they can type instructions, and the notes field is where you learn that some people are not doing too well. I mean, most of them are normal notes, like, "Here's my gate code, watch out for the dog," and stuff like that. Some notes, though, are not normal. You end up delivering to the not-so-normal ones anyway, just doing so a bit more cautiously. One more piece of context before I dive into it. This job is more dangerous than you might think, in the regular human ways. Drivers do get robbed or carjacked, followed, or worse. It's in the news a few times a year if you're looking for it. It never trends, not usually, because we're not too interesting. I'm not saying that for sympathy. I'm saying it because it's the reason guys like me end up with a little mental filing cabinet of bad addresses and gut rules. And most of the cabinet is about people. Creepy people with guns who bring them out to get the food from me and act like they're about to do something bad. So that's the setup. I've been doing this for about 4 years, full-time for most of it. And this is the stuff I wanted to share. The stories I've not been able to shake off. The Yard. I'll start with the one that's just people. This one actually affects how I work every single night. I was about 8 months into this DoorDash gig. An order came through around midnight. It had a decent payout, $9 and change for a short run. Someone wanted some fast food going to a house on the north end of town. The north end is fine. It's the older houses with working people. I deliver up there constantly. But this specific street was dark, and that's what I noticed first and right away when I pulled into it. The street light was out. Half the porch lights were off. The house I wanted to go to had no lights at all. Not a one. Not crazy, but definitely a low red flag. I thought to myself, people sometimes forget to leave their porch light on for me, that's fine. But usually when someone orders $60 of food at midnight, they're awake and ready to get it. There's a TV glow or something coming through the windows. But this house was dead dark. But there were two guys standing in the yard. They weren't on the porch, but in the yard out on the grass, about 10 feet apart from each other, facing the street. You might think they were smoking or having a drink or on their phones or talking, but they weren't. They just looked like they were waiting on something, and I assumed that something was me. I slowed down, and my phone buzzed. It was a text from the customer through the app, saying, "Doorbell broke, pull in the driveway, bring it around back." I've had a lot of time to think about how close I came, and about what went through my head in order. First thought, honest to God, was, "Don't be rude." That's the first thing my brain served up. These are probably his buddies. The backyard thing is probably normal. Don't be weird about people's houses. Your whole life you get trained to not be rude, and that training does not care at all whether you live through the night. The second thought was that the payout was $9, and my third thought was the one that saved me. It wasn't even smart. It was just a detail that didn't fit. The order was under a woman's name. The account said Melissa, and texts in the app come through under the account name. So my phone said Melissa was asking me to come around the back of a dark house. Except when that text came in, I was already looking at the yard, and one of the two guys standing out there had his face lit up by a phone now, typing. When I saw him finish, the light went off his face and my phone buzzed. Another message, quote-unquote, from Melissa. It said, "Sound good?" When it got obvious that I thought it wasn't good and that I would not be doing this, both of those men turned their heads at the same time, and one of them began to walk towards my car. Not fast, but definitely coming towards me. I drove off with the food then. They didn't run after me or anything. I watched in the mirror, and they stopped at the curb, standing there watching me go. Then the phone buzzed twice more while I drove. The first message said, "Wrong house, LOL, come back." The second one, about a minute later, said, "We see you." I called support and they told me to mark it as unable to deliver, and they gave me half the pay. The girl on the line could not have cared less, which honestly at the time made me feel like maybe it was nothing. So I ate some of the food myself, a couple of chicken sandwiches, but I could barely taste it. I had that bitter taste of bile in my mouth from how nervous I'd gotten. Now, there's a Facebook group for Dashers in my area. A few hundred of us, mostly used for complaining about parking and posting when the McDonald's ice cream machine is down. And it's down a lot. About 2 weeks after my thing, a woman posted in that group from a hospital bed. Before her trip to the hospital, she had delivered to the same street. But she didn't nope out at the curb like I did. She pulled into the driveway because it was a normal order at 9 at night, when two men pulled her out of her car, took the car, the food, her phone, and her bag, and left her in the yard with a broken wrist. The account that ordered hers was under a woman's name too, using a stolen card, stolen account, and had apparently, according to the cops, had placed that order themselves, waiting in the yard for whoever the app sends. The house was empty, it was a rental between tenants, and these guys were taking advantage of that fact. I never posted about my near miss until after hers, and it made me feel bad. I probably should have said something. If she had seen it, maybe she would have driven away too, like I did. She got a broken wrist and I got chicken sandwiches. The Facebook group changed after her post too. It got serious for a while, but it was more useful. People began to post plate numbers and door camera clips. Somebody made a shared map, and that map is still going on. It's one of the most helpful things in my life as a driver now. Better than support or cops. Just a bunch of delivery drivers helping each other out. So nowadays, I do not deliver to dark houses without texting first. And no, I'm not ever going around back, even if they request it. I don't care if folks think I look dramatic. I don't want my crap stolen and my bones broken. The house on Delmore. There's a house in town I delivered to for about a year and a half, regularly. Sometimes 3 times a week, and I never once saw a whole person there. The first time I got the place, the note said, "Do not knock, do not ring bell. Place food on the mat, then return to the street and wait by your car until the door has closed. Thank you." A long and very weird note, but fine. People do have anxiety. People have dogs that lose their minds at a knock. People work nights and have a sleeping baby. So you see notes like this more than you'd think, and the first chunk of that note is genuinely common. But it's the last part that was weird. Wait by your car until the door has closed. Most people don't care what you do after the food is down. So why would I have to wait? I did it anyway. I set the bag on the mat, and I walked back to the street, and I stood there like an idiot next to my car. For a minute, nothing happened, and I was about to just leave when the porch light cut off. Then the door opened. 4, maybe 5 inches. No face in the gap, no hello, nothing but dark in the crack of it. But then an arm came out through the gap down low at about shin height, like somebody lying on the floor inside. The hand felt around flat on the mat until it found the bag handle and dragged it in. The door shut, and I heard the lock from the street. More than one lock, actually. Sounded like a whole sequence. Okay, so a person lying on the floor of their house reached out for their food. My working theory for a long time was that it was some kind of disability. I'm not trying to make fun of anyone. Maybe it was someone who can't stand or had agoraphobia so bad that even opening the door bit was a crisis. There are real explanations to this, and I ran through all of them 100 times, usually while standing by my car on that street watching that door. All I really have are the details that stacked up over a year and a half. The arm was always low. Never a person standing, not one time. I never saw their silhouette or a shadow moving in the window, and I looked. 18 months of deliveries, and the most of a human being I ever saw at that address was an arm below the knee height of a door. The orders changed depending on the time. Daytime orders, the handful I caught, were normal. Family food, pizza, 2 liters. Late orders would be different. Always meat. And I'm not trying to be spooky about it. I mean, the order would be from a winged place, and it would be 4, 5, 6 orders of plain grilled chicken with no sauce and nothing else on the ticket. One time there was a 12-pack of plain patties from a burger place and no buns. You see the bag receipt when you grab it. You can't not see it. The girl at the wing place knew the address by heart too, and had her own opinions about it. She called it the dog food order. Said it in a joking voice, but then didn't joke any further about it. But that could be the case. People do order plain patties for their dogs. I've seen that before. One more physical detail, since I was on that porch a couple 100 times. The place smelled like bleach. Not every time, but often enough. Bleach strong enough to reach you through a closed front door at all hours, and the mat got replaced over and over. The same cheap brown mat from the dollar store. I'd see it go from new to worn, like anybody's mat does. Then some night it would just be brand new again. I must have set food down on 6 or 7 of that identical mat over the year and a half at that house alone. There are normal reasons to go through doormats. The note evolved too. For about a year it was the same note. But then one night there was a new line at the bottom, saying, "If the door is already open when you arrive, do not approach the house. Keep the food. You'll still be paid." What? I sat in my car and reread that line. You'll still be paid. Somebody in that house had thought about a specific situation in enough detail to pre-write instructions for it. But what was that situation? It read like, in case of emergency, let DoorDash driver eat the food and not come in. I was so bewildered and confused by this. The door being open was a scenario, and that scenario had a protocol, and the protocol was don't come near us, no matter what. Okay, that was creepy, thinking about it like that. And one night, the door was open. I pulled up around 11 with a bag of the plain chicken that I mentioned before. The porch light was on for once, and the front door stood wide open onto a dark hallway. It was a nice night, and I stayed at the curb in my car, staring at that open door, waiting for something to happen. I had their bag in my lap, but I was frozen to the spot. An open door should be nothing. Could be someone airing out their house. But I had to do what the note said. I kept the food, and I marked it as delivered, which you're not supposed to do officially, and I drove 2 streets over before I even breathed right. The payment cleared and the tip doubled that night, silently, without a message. So whoever they were, they had been paying attention in there, probably watching me, and they were satisfied with my performance. I decided to get out one time to ask a neighbor about them. There was a guy 2 doors down out watering his lawn while I waited by my car for this customer's door to close. I nodded at the house and said something like, "You ever meet the folks who live here?" He shut the water off to answer, and he said to me, "Well, they're quiet." "That's good," I replied. And he shook his head and said, "Not really," and he turned the water back on. I'm still not sure what he meant by that, and yet I still understood enough. Whatever silence was happening at this house was not the good kind. The last thing before I leave this one alone was the final stretch of orders. The notes added one more line. That line was, "Do not look at the upstairs window." It didn't say which upstairs window. The place had 2 of them facing the street, and I had never looked at them in my life before because why would I? And now I had been told not to? So of course I wanted to look. Anybody would. And one night I did look, during a particular delivery. The left window had nothing in it but a curtain. But in the right window, I saw someone standing there, right up against the glass, pale and unmoving, and too tall for how close the face was to the top of the frame. I say face, but what I mean is a pale oval turned toward the street. It didn't move when I looked, and it didn't duck away like you'd catch a normal person doing. They were just there the entire time I set the food down, the walk back to my car, and I know because I checked again from the car. So I broke the rules twice. But that figure never moved. It was there the next delivery too. Same window, same spot, and same height. The delivery after that as well. 3 visits over maybe 2 weeks, and that thing stood in the right upstairs window like it was a piece of furniture. Then the orders stopped. Forever. 18 months of 3 a week and then nothing. I drove by on purpose about a month later. Mail had been piled up under the box, and the grass was a foot tall now. Both upstairs windows were now empty, and a realtor sign showed up eventually, and I didn't go to the open house. The wing girl asked me one time whatever happened to the dog food order, and I told her I think they moved. She said good. And that's the end of that story. Route J. This is a shorter one. An order came in around 1 in the morning. A gas station pizza going out to an address on Route J, which runs southwest out of town and turns to nothing pretty quick. 22-minute drive, $12 payout. I take stuff like that all the time. Just a normal rural run. The pin took me down J past the last yard light and had me turn onto a gravel road. Then the pin said I had arrived. I was next to a field, No driveway, no mailbox, no house. It was a hayfield with a tree line way at the back of it, with a gate hanging open, and past what my headlights reached, it was just black. This also happens more than you'd think. Rural pins being dropped wrong constantly, sometimes a quarter mile off. So I did the normal thing and texted the customer that I was at the pin and didn't see the house. The reply came back in about 5 seconds, which at 1 a.m. is pretty fast. It said, "I see you. Come through the gate and walk up to the light." The light? There was no light that I could see, none. I was parked facing that whole field. I could see the tree line, and there was no light anywhere to be found. No house light past it. Nothing but my own headlights on the grass. So I texted back, "Sorry, I don't see a light, and I'm not allowed to go too far from my car." That's not a rule, but it is absolutely one of mine. The reply came back fast again, saying, "No, the light is behind you." I didn't check behind me by turning around. I checked a mirror, as if that made a difference. But in that moment it felt like it made a world of difference. In the mirror I saw the gravel road and darkness. A third text came before I'd answered anything, and the third one said, "You're almost there." I wasn't almost anywhere. I was sitting still. I put my car in reverse and backed all the way up that gravel to the blacktop. I didn't want to take the time to turn around, and I called support driving back to town. The guy canceled it out and said the customer could contact them about a refund. I got full pay and kept a cold pizza. In the group later, I posted the address, and what came back is the only reason this one made the list even though nothing actually happened to me. 2 other Dashers replied that they'd gotten that same field before. One about a year before me, and one just a few weeks before. They had different customer names on the order every time. And they were all very old names. Mine was Opal, one of theirs was Wilbur, and the other was something like Eunice. Nobody under 80 is named that, and nobody over 80 is texting a delivery app at 1 a.m. from a hayfield. They got the same word-for-word messages otherwise, and I mean the same. Both of them quoted, "The light is behind you," before I'd typed it, like it was a script and not a DoorDash delivery. The one who had encountered that field a year back said one more thing. She said when she had gotten there was snow in the field, and when she got out to look around before the texts started, the snow between the gate and her car had footprints in it, coming to the car but not going back. Sweet Sea. For a while, there was a pickup spot in a half-dead strip mall on the east side, listed in the app as a restaurant with one of those internet-only names, like Wing Commander or Melt Factory, the names that ghost kitchens use. Ghost kitchens are real and normal, by the way. That's not part of the story, really. I'm just telling you what it is. When a regular kitchen cooks under 10 fake brand names for the apps, that's a ghost kitchen. But yeah, fine and normal. This one was Sweet Sea, next to a vape store, and every other unit in the place was empty. The pickup instructions said the food would be on a chair inside the front door. Doors unlocked, take your order, and go. And that's how it went. Glass storefront papered over from the inside, front door open, and just inside there was a folding chair with stapled shut bags on it, and a hallway in the back with a light on. Somebody was always standing partway down that hallway. Every pickup. But they never came up front. Never said hey. Just a guy-shaped outline down the hall making sure you took the right bag. You'd grab your bag and the outline wouldn't move and you would just leave. The bags were strange too. Stapled shut, which is not strange itself, but it's the way they were stapled. I'm talking rows upon rows of dozens of staples per bag. Like someone really didn't want this thing opened at the wrong time. Plus, it was cold. The type of place this was. It shouldn't have cold bags. The food here would have been warm or hot, and the way they felt was square and condensed. The fast food I've delivered never packs flat and perfectly square like that. And the deliveries for this place went to normal apartments and rentals all over town. About half the time, the drop instructions were just leave at the door, for a door where I could hear a TV and see feet shadow under it. Though sometimes I'd deliver to someone for this place, where it would be a guy who would open the door before I even knocked, and rip it out of my hand without eye contact. A wee bit suspicious, yeah. I did about 15 of those over a couple of months, before one of the bags had a burst staple, top gaping, and I looked in. There were these vacuum-sealed bricks with a towel folded over them. That's all I saw, and that's all I wanted to see. I finished that delivery like a coward, hands sweating on the wheel, then I blocked that pickup in my settings. Eventually, I did call the tip line for the police, and I told them what I saw in case it was something bad. But I don't think they cared that much, so maybe I was overreacting? Well, I would soon get my answer. A couple of months later, Sweet C was empty. The paper had been torn down, the chair was gone, and the restaurant vanished off the app entirely. But there was no news story that I ever found, so that was as much of an answer as I was going to get. I just find it kind of crazy that if that place was doing something illegal, we were doing business for them and didn't even know it. I was one dasher out of hundreds, and we were cheerfully and ignorantly being dispatched all over town as a distribution network for whatever was in that bag. The order to my address. There was a certain night where I got followed. That part by itself has a boring explanation, and the boring explanation might even be true. It was a white Impala, and I first noticed it behind me at a McDonald's on the south side when I was picking up a stacked order, which is when the app gives you 2 deliveries out of the same store. It stayed behind me through 3 drop-offs. With a town like mine, there's 100 white Impalas, and only so many roads. A guy running his own errands could plausibly shadow my route for 20 minutes without ever knowing I exist. I know that. At the 3rd stop, I sat in my car until it drove past and it turned off. And I told myself, yeah, just someone running errands. And I finished my night. 4 days later, an order popped up on my screen, and the delivery address was my apartment building. My building. My street. I mean, that happens. People in my building order food. I have delivered to my own neighbors. It's funny even, knocking on a door a few feet from your own. So I looked at it, and the unit number was mine. The name on the order was Christopher. My name is not Christopher, and I do not know a Christopher. And no one that I do know would prank me this way, because nobody who knows me even understands how the Dasher side of the app works. The order was 1 black coffee from a gas station, a $2 item carrying a $9 tip, which is kind of bait, if you ask me. That's a tip designed to make a Dasher grab it fast without reading. I declined it, but it came back around. The app re-offers stuff, and I declined it again. I sat in a parking lot, my mind a bit boggled. Then I drove home the long way and parked a street over, watching my own building for a while, like some lunatic. But I didn't see anything strange. The lights were off at my place just as I'd left them. I called support. I'll summarize the call. The girl was actually nice, she understood, and she also had genuinely no tool in front of her for someone placed an order from my own address. She could report the customer account for fraud. That was all she had for me. I asked if she could tell me anything about the account, but obviously she couldn't. And I asked what happens if I'd accepted my own order. She thought for a second, then said, "Please don't do that," which was the most human moment I've ever had with support. Thankfully, it never happened again. No coffee ever showed up, no Christopher, and no Impala that I noticed. For a couple of months after, I did a thing where I'd finish my night, park, then sit in the car for a few minutes, watching my own front door again, before deciding it was safe to walk in. Doing that, when you're so ready to get home and take your shoes off, it's a miserable feeling. Being a stranger, casing your own place. I pay rent there and I have to feel unsafe. I think it was just a glitch. Maybe some rando fat-fingered an address that happened to be mine down to the unit. I've since moved, and I'm happy about that, until it happens again at this address. I hope it doesn't. The passenger seat. So my car does this thing I've never told any mechanic about. Some background. Modern cars have a weight sensor in the passenger seat. That's how it knows to nag you with the seatbelt chime when somebody's sitting there unbuckled, and how it knows not to nag you about your backpack, usually. Mine's a 15-year-old Corolla with 240,000 miles, and its sensor is honestly pretty reliable. Food bags never set it off. A case of water will, but a person always does. But something like a jacket, never. 4 years of this job, I know my car's opinions better than I know my own. There was an address out past the fairgrounds, a little shut-up-looking house with foil in one window. I delivered to it a handful of times. Nothing happened at that house. That part matters because everything else in this one happened in my car. The drops were leave at the door, normal notes, nobody ever opened up. The food went off the porch eventually because the porch was empty the next time I came. Normal stuff. Except after the second or third run out there, a few minutes into the drive back, my seatbelt chime went off, the passenger side. Ding, 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 the little red icon of a person lit up on the dash. But there was nothing at all on the seat. I'm not going to pretend that scared me because it didn't. The older the car, the more run down it is. Sensors glitch. I patted the seat, actually saying, "Nobody here, bud," to my own dashboard, and the chime quit after a minute, like they do, and I forgot about it by the next stop. It only ever happened leaving that address. That's what took me an embarrassing number of weeks to notice. I only noticed because of this smell. My car smells like food. That's the job. Fries forever. It's in the fabric. Driving away from that house, the times I paid attention, the food smell was suddenly gone. It wasn't covered up by anything, just suddenly absent, like driving someone else's car, and the chime would go ding 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 at the empty seat. The last time I took an order out there, the chime started before I was off their street, and it didn't quit after 1 minute. It went on the whole drive. 15 minutes of ding, ding, ding that I couldn't turn off. The only thing that stops it is buckling the seatbelt, and I'd like to state for the record that I drove 11 of those 15 minutes telling myself I would not do that it was just a glitch. Buckling a seatbelt for a glitch is insane. Then I hit the light at the bypass and the chime was still going. The little red person still on my dashboard. I reached over and pulled the passenger belt across the empty seat and clicked it in. The chime stopped. The rest of that drive, my car was normal. The fry smell came back somewhere around the mall. It's just crazy that it had to come back at all. What was holding it back? And when I parked at my apartment and looked over, before I even thought about it, I said, "End of the line," like a bus driver, jokingly, to my empty passenger seat with its belt on. I reached over and unclicked the belt to undo it, and I swear on my grandmother, and I've sworn on her twice in my life, the seat made a sound. That little exhale a seat makes when heavy weight comes up off of it. Everybody's heard that sound 1,000 times getting out of cars or off of furniture. You just never think about it much. And I heard it right there coming out of my seat that was supposed to have nothing on it, because I could see nothing on it. My hand was still on the buckle. Thank God that chime thing never happened again. And the Corolla's sensor is back to its regular opinions, no longer hallucinating, though honestly I don't think it was a hallucination. My friend, Dennis, I told this story to personally. And he told me jokingly, "At least you buckled him up." Marlene. Now the big one. This is the one I measure the others against. There lies a stretch of hills southeast of town. where the roads give up and it goes to gravel roads and hollers. The deep little valleys back in the hills, and people live back in there. Not many, but there's mailboxes all the way back. My zone technically covers the near edge of it. Orders from back in there are rare, because past a certain distance, the app just won't offer them. But the near hollers ping sometimes. And one night, I got one that made me actually say something out loud alone in my car. Family restaurant food, a big order. The payout was $41. 41! The drive was 28 minutes one way. Somebody had tipped enormously, and the name on that order was Marlene. The address took me down a lettered road, then onto gravel that wound on down into a holler, headlights on trees the whole way. The trees opened up, and there sat a house, an old 2-story farmhouse, white and well kept, at least from what my lights showed. And the porch light was on, warm and yellow and inviting. Honest to God, my first feeling when I saw it was relief. A lit porch at the end of a drive like that is the most welcome sign in the world. The note on the order said, "Set it on the stump by the porch steps. Honk twice as you leave. Thank you kindly. God bless." There was a stump by the porch steps, wide and flat, like it got used for a lot of different things. So I set the bags on it, and the food was a lot. Like buffet amounts, family packs of fried chicken and a gallon of tea. Standing there in that porch light, I clocked 2 things without going looking for either one of them. First thing, no cars. No truck, no nothing. Not even tire ruts in the grass. You cannot live down a road like that without some sort of vehicle. That's not a possible lifestyle. Second thing, and I didn't put this one together until I was driving away. There were no lines. No power lines whatsoever coming down into that holler. No poles by the house and no meter on the wall that I could see. And yet, the porch light was on. I honked twice at the bend, like the note said. In my mirror, right as the house slid out of view, the porch light went off, and the front door opened. But I was too far away then to see if there was someone there. Only trees in my mirror. That was the first delivery. I did that run 6 more times over about 1.5 years. Always said Marlene, and always a lot of food, with a tip that made it stupid to say no. Every time I told myself this would be the last, then rent would become due and I would forget things like that. So here's what 1.5 years of that run taught me, written all at once. The stump money. On the 3rd or 4th run to that place, along with the in-app tip, there was cash under a flat rock on the stump. They were folded bills in a torn piece of paper bag with pencil on it that said, "For the driver." The bills were old. Not dirty old, but more like out of a drawer, crisp and off-color. One of them was a $10 silver certificate, which I didn't know was a thing until I Googled it in my car at the top of the holler. They stopped printing those in the 60s. It spent fine at the gas station, which somehow makes it worse. The clerk even held one up and said, "You don't see these anymore," and I said it was just old family money, which wasn't a lie so much as a guess about whose family money it was. I kept the last one they left. It's in my glove box right now. I don't fully know why. It just feels rude to spend all of a thing like that. Then there were the figures. Twice at the tree line past the house, at the edge of what headlights reached, there were people standing, I'm sure of it. They were people-shaped. There were 2 of them the first time, then maybe 4 the second, spread out in the trees, at 11 at night, in a holler with 1 house and no cars. Were they farm neighbors checking in on the food delivery? Perhaps. Probably not. Let me tell you about the singing. During one run, while I was still setting the bags down, I heard singing coming from inside the house. It was quiet, but there were more than one voice. It was very old-fashioned, like a hymn, though I couldn't name it, and I couldn't make out one single word. It didn't stop or drop when my feet hit the porch boards. It kept going, unbothered. The sound of people enjoying a song together. And I stood there a second longer, because, truthfully, it was very pretty. Then a floorboard moved somewhere over my head, somewhere upstairs. One long, slow creak under some real weight, and the singing kept going downstairs while that weight moved upstairs, so I walked real fast back to the car. I paid one of those $20 records websites to look up the property. I hope that's not too stalkery, but anyway, the parcel's taxes are paid every year on time, under a certain family name. But the house has had no electric service since the 80s, and they've never had a phone line. The last person on record living on that parcel died the year my mom was born. But I never did find the name Marlene. Something down there is ordering $40 of fried chicken through a smartphone app and tipping in silver certificates. Now, the last run. The note was longer. It said, "Set it on the stump. No need to honk this time. Don't take orders from down here after tonight, sweetheart. You've been real good to us. God bless you." This order was small for the first time. One dinner, one drink, and it felt like the end of something. The cash under the rock was strange. $200 bills. Modern, too. I stood there in that porch light feeling calm, scared, and delighted at the same time. It's hard to explain. I said out loud to the yard, to anyone that was hearing, "Thank you so much. Y'all take care." And I got in the car. As I pulled out, in the mirror, the porch light went off and the door came open, as always, except this time I could see it from where I was. In that doorway, low about the height of a child, or of someone sitting down, there was a pale patch in the dark that had not been there the other times, and it stayed put. I drove up out of the holler at a speed that was not appropriate for that gravel. No orders have come from down there since. Sometimes when things are slow, I sit at the top of that lettered road for a minute with the app on, kind of daring it to give me an order. But nothing happens. I drove back down there once during the day, a year after these events, telling myself it was curiosity, but it felt more like a visit. The house is there, real, still standing, and in daylight, you can see it's in better shape than some empty house has a right to be. Nice clear paint, the porch is swept. Still no cars and no lines and no meter, exactly like my headlights always showed me. I did not get out, though. It didn't feel unwelcome. It felt like showing up at someone's place uninvited, on a day that they were not expecting you. And I was raised better than that. So I turned around in the yard, careful of the grass, and I went back up to the blacktop. Whatever that arrangement was, it's over. And I got told it was over politely, called sweetheart, and got $200. I've been telling people this story for a while now, and the question they usually ask is, would you take the order if it pinged tonight? And the true answer is, yeah. Not sure what that says about me, but yes. They were nice to me, whatever or whoever they were. And it's the only stop on this whole list where it felt like someone was looking out for me, instead of just looking at me. Carol H. This one I didn't even clock as strange until it was over. That's its own kind of creepy. Over about 2 years, I delivered to a customer named Carol H. But it was at 4 different addresses. Same person every single time. Little old woman, tiny, white hair in a bun, always came up to the door even when the order said leave it. Always wearing a housecoat, one of those flower print ones. She'd crack the storm door and say, "Thank you, honey," and take the bag with both hands. I know it was the same woman. She had the same voice, inflections, used both hands to grab every time, and of course the same face. You remember your sweetest regulars. Dashers might argue a lot, but everybody agrees the little old ladies are the best stops of your night. Her order never changed. A bowl of potato soup and a dinner roll from a home cooking place in town. Smallest order in the world, with a $5 tip, which for a $4 soup is somebody being kind on purpose. The first address was a little brick place near the fairgrounds. I took her that soup about a dozen times, then the orders stopped. A few months after that, Carol H. pinged again from a different address across town. I thought nothing of it. People move. Old ladies have family they move in with. Whatever. Same soup, same housecoat, same "thank you, honey." That address ran a while, then went quiet. She popped up at a third after that, a duplex out toward the highway. And by now, she was just my moving regular. And it was kind of a joke to me. Like, where's Carol living these days? Where is she gonna pop up next? There was a dozen soup orders there, too. Let me tell you the one thing she ever said to me besides "thank you, honey." It happened at the third address, and I smiled about it for months before I learned better. At the first delivery to the duplex, when she cracked open the storm door, she looked genuinely pleased, almost tickled, and she said, "You found me." And I said something like, "The GPS finds everybody, ma'am." She laughed and took her soup with both hands. Cute as anything. You found me. I'd give a whole lot to have never learned the rest of it, so that it could have stayed cute. The fourth address came through on a rainy night, out on the older east edge of town. The GPS put me at a little white house with the porch light on, and Carol cracked the storm door, saying, "Thank you, honey," and took her soup with both hands. A typical night. I did that address twice more over a couple of weeks. Then I mentioned her at the Dasher parking lot. You see, there's a parking lot by the mall where 4 or 5 of us end up sitting between runs most nights, windows down and whatnot. I was telling Dennis, who's been delivering things in this town since before apps, pizza in the 90s, all that jazz, about my little old soup lady, who moves every few months. I even said the East Side address out loud. Dennis literally stopped chewing. He asked for the street number again, and he said that house burned. I was confused. I had just been there 3 days ago, so I told him that. He immediately whipped out his phone and went to the newspaper site and turned the screen around. There was the house. The fire was 12 years ago, and it was fatal. The lady who died in it was named Carol. Sitting in that parking lot with my ears ringing, the first thing I went for was the photo. The app makes you take a delivery photo at the door. I don't do it when they hand take the order, but the rainy night, the very first East Side delivery, she had been slow to the door, so I'd already snapped the photo of the bag on the mat before she opened up, so it was in my history. I found it right there in the lot with Dennis watching, and part of me expected a burned lot with a soup bag sitting in the weeds. But what I saw was different. The photo showed the bag on a mat and a porch. The porch was gray, and the boards behind the bag were dark in blotches that I took for rain when I took the picture, and the door frame behind it was empty. And I mean as in no door at all, just the frame with dark behind it. I had stood on that porch, and I'd heard the storm door. The photo did not show a storm door. I drove back out there the next morning, daylight and off the clock. Dennis was right. It was a burned lot, a slab with some black stubs, a chimney lying where it fell, grass through everything, gone 12 years, exactly as the newspaper said. I stood in the weeds where a porch used to be, roughly where a mat would go. I waited there, not sure why I was. Then eventually I got back in my car and went back to work. If this place in particular burned down, why did she appear at other places? That was a thought I kept wondering about, so I did some investigating. The first address, the brick place by the fairgrounds. That's a rental now, and the property site says its longest owner, decades of it, passed away in her 90s some years back. Also named Carol something. And I got the idea without even needing to look up the rest. If you want my assumption of the idea, well, perhaps the spirit of someone who died in a fire has been hijacking the addresses of people with the same name. Crazy? Yes. But I'm all out of sanity. The murder. The last one here has no ghosts in it, and I'd say it's probably the worst one, depending on how you define worst. About a year ago, I took a late order going way out east, food from the all-night diner by the truck stop, heading to a house at the end of a country blacktop I'd been down maybe twice in my life. I had to drive down a long straight road, with fields on both sides. No other lights around except mailbox reflectors, and I had the windows cracked because it was a nice night, and my car smelled like somebody else's chicken fried steak, which is a nice smell, at least to me. A couple miles in, I came upon a car stopped on the shoulder. They were facing my way on the opposite side, a dark sedan, and its back door was hanging open, so the dome light was on. And out here, that little dome light was the brightest thing in a mile. So I did what I like to think anybody would do. I took my foot off the gas and slowed down, just in case somebody was broke down or hurt. I got a long, slow, well-lit look at the car as I rolled past, and here's what I saw in that moment. There was a woman in the back seat. She was leaned over against the far window, cheek on the glass and eyes shut. Her mouth was open a little, and she had dark hair stuck across her face. Her lipstick was wrecked, red and smeared off her mouth and down at an angle, like she had drunkenly wiped at her face. She was obviously passed out. That's what she looked like. It was a sight I was used to, having delivered on weekend nights to all sorts of people. I've seen people fall asleep in cars or on porches in that exact boneless kind of way. Then I saw a man outside the car. He was walking in a circle on the shoulder with a phone up to his ear. When my lights came up on him, he stopped walking and turned his head, looking right at me. He looked and kept looking, the whole time it took my car to roll past his, and he never said anything into the phone that I saw. The look on his face was indignation. The man was not embarrassed or concerned. He looked furious, jaw set and eyes coming with me as I went by. His whole face looked like I had done something to him that he suddenly remembered, and I recall even waving at him, trying to be friendly, but the man did not wave back. I put my window up quickly. I drove on and delivered the food, and when I headed back to town, I took a different path. In my head, here's what I thought happened that night. The couple was having a rough one. She drank too much, they probably fought. She's sleeping it off in the back. He's outside calling her sister or a tow or just cooling down, and the anger is because a stranger rolled by at 2 miles an hour and eyeballed the worst moment of their week. That story explained everything I saw, cleanly. So by the time I made it to my drop, I was mostly thinking about whether the fries had gone cold yet. The next evening, I was sitting in the parking lot between runs, scrolling through my phone. The local news had a woman's picture up, and I recognized her before I read anything. It was a dark-haired woman, her driver's license photo. She was smiling. It was the same woman I saw passed out, head on the window. But the headline said they'd found her body that morning. She had been found on that road in a ditch, and she had been dead since sometime the night before. Since before I drove past. I read through that whole article 5 times, I swear, and the pieces in my head began to turn over one at a time, slowly like cards. The lipstick smeared downward off the mouth and down. That wasn't lipstick. It was blood. Her eyes shut and her mouth open against the glass, not sleeping. She was dead. And I should have known something was wrong. 2 people, but she was in the back seat. When 2 people who care about each other take a car somewhere, she would be riding up front next to him. He would be keeping an eye on her. But she was in the back, probably just tossed back there until he had an idea of what to do. That man stared daggers at me, because he literally probably wanted to put a dagger in me for catching him after the act. They put the suspect's picture up the next day. The boyfriend. And it was him. It didn't just resemble him, it was the same man from the shoulder. I decided to call the sheriff's office to tell them what I witnessed. They took down all my information. They thanked me, took my number down, and I spent 2 days rehearsing for the interview, wondering if I'd have to appear in a courtroom. But nobody ever called, and no one ever showed up at my house. That man was arrested the same day. I found out on the news like everyone else. I guess they had all they needed without me. Maybe his work was too sloppy. In the end, my 4 seconds of driving by witnessing the most horrible thing in the world, those 4 seconds ended up being just for me. Great. Yep, I'm still a DoorDasher. The crazy things I've seen have slowed down, and I hope they stay that way. I'm not sure how much more I can handle. I'm here to remind you that DoorDashers and other delivery drivers might sometimes deal with some of the craziest and often terrifying things you can think of. So tip them well. Tip them like their lives depend on it, because their rent definitely does, and their lives might be on the line, even if they're not aware of it. Really, I hate that I order DoorDash so much. It's so easy, so convenient, because I just love my fresh McDonald's fries not being fresh. And I love having to pray that no one reached into the bag and definitely didn't eat one of my McDonald's fries. I really need to get a hold of myself, but don't worry, I do tip well. Good night. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. Send me your scary work-related stories at eeriecast.com/submit and support our show by becoming a premium member over at erie.fm. Premium members never get any ads on any of our shows, and they get exclusive bonus episodes and audiobooks, and more. Plus, you'll be supporting us and keeping us afloat, because the world is crazy, and YouTube is even crazier. Till next time, everyone, I've got to clock out, but I'll be clocking back in real soon.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Every town has that story of the kid who went too far. That kid is either in prison, dead, or has simply never been the same. Such is life. But in this story from Lay B, we learn there is an alternate and possibly more terrifying fate for that kid who thinks rules are for goobers. And that fate would be encountering disturbing beings that should not exist. Lay B warns us with her story to beware and respect the moon-eyed people of the Blue Ridge Mountains. This is a tale from the Break Room. I grew up at the base of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a sub-range of the Appalachians in the Piedmont region of North Carolina. The folklore and legends from my state always fascinated me as a kid, and my family begrudgingly tolerated my exploration of the subject. We took evening drives up the parkway to see the Brown Mountain Lights. We once drove to Bear Creek, North Carolina, to see the infamous Devil's Stomping Ground. On a trip to the Outer Banks, we made a point to visit Topsoil Island, where the Gray Lady is meant to pace the beach. The older I got, the more history intertwined with the folklore and legends from my state, and these connections always piqued my interest. In my teens, I explored cemeteries where Civil War soldiers were buried, and I navigated revolutionary battlefields with alleged sightings and hauntings. I went to a university in the South, majoring in history and folklore, graduating with honors. I paid to take courses in cemetery iconography and preservation. I volunteered with my local historical society. I did these things to understand the history of my home, but also hoped that maybe one day I would find proof that the folklore rang true, that there was something special about the legends in North Carolina which had survived through oral tradition for decades, passed down through generations of North Carolinians. It's no surprise that my career path took me into similar realms. I am a cultural heritage public historian, meaning I work for museums and sites of public history throughout North and South Carolina. My specialty is oral history. I basically supplement artifacts in museums with stories from ordinary Carolinians who choose to tell me about their lives. These stories become archived interviews, which are held in archival repositories in perpetuity. Through oral history and public history work, I've managed to turn my interest in social and local history into a career, and I've met some of the most fascinating and interesting people along the way. Ethel was one of those people that I will never forget. I first met Ethel in the fall of 2015. Museum staff were doing research for an exhibit on sharecropping, and a family friend suggested I interview her. If she agreed, of course. Sharecropping, for those unfamiliar, was an exploitative system suffered by poor farmers, both white and black, in the period after the American Civil War. Landlords contracted out land in return for a portion of the crop yield, hence the name sharecropping. The majority of sharecroppers across the South were poor white families, and it was one of the only ways for farmers to earn a living prior to the Second World War, if they didn't own any land. It was an unpredictable way of life. Sharecropping forced families to farm cash crops like tobacco and cotton for the highest yields, but also left them reliant on good growing conditions and at the mercy of the landowner. Life was so difficult under these conditions that farm families relied on the labor of their own children for help, and the children began performing chores and tasks around the farm as early as 4 or 5. Ethel was pushing 93 when I contacted her for an interview, but despite her age, she was sharp as a tack. I made the initial contact with her through a telephone call, where I explained what a life history interview was, and where I laid out the benefits of recording her oral history. She seemed wary, not of the practice of recording her story, but of the value it might have. She didn't believe her life would make an interesting story. Oh, how she was wrong about that. With additional questions asked, and with me assuring her that her experience with sharecropping was useful to our exhibit, we decided on a date and time for the interview. Now, given her age and thinking of her comfort, I suggested recording the interview in her house, which was well into the mountain region of the state. I was thrilled when she agreed, because it meant I could take advantage of staying at my grandparents' mountain home, a vacation home they had purchased in my preteen years. The mountain house, as we called it, was a 3-bedroom cabin tucked into the Grandfather Mountain area of the Blue Ridge Mountains. You had to traverse a pretty steep road with no guardrails to make it up the hill and into the gravel driveway. The house itself was 2 stories with a full basement. The basement was mostly used for laundry and the storage of deck chairs, swings, and outdoor games and equipment. The second floor had floor-to-ceiling glass windows, which looked into an open, airy living room with a massive rock fireplace. The dining area and kitchen were both on the second floor as well, as the whole floor was open concept. At the foot of the stairs leading up to the second floor was the door leading to the wraparound porch. The second floor held 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, and 2 additional balconies, which overlooked the first floor wraparound porch. The house itself was built above a steep gully, maybe 20 feet deep. When my grandparents first bought the place, we all started to call this drop in the earth the gorge. As in, kids, stay well away from the edge of the gorge. The porch and second-story balconies overlooked the gorge, and we all enjoyed sitting outside and watching wildlife in and around it. As a family, we only visited the cabin during the spring, summer, and fall for get-togethers and Sunday lunch cookouts. Otherwise, the cabin offered a quiet weekend away for anyone who would find the time to make the drive. This was exactly what I hoped for the weekend I was set to interview Ethel. I planned to head to Ethel's house, interview her for a few hours, maybe do some work Friday afternoon, then spend Friday evening sipping wine on the porch of the house. Saturday, I would wander around the local museum and shops, maybe take a short hike to see some waterfalls in the area. Sunday morning, I would start down the mountain, making it home in time for Sunday lunch at my grandmother's. The following Friday, after my call with Ethel, I packed the car, eager to start the drive through the Blue Ridge Mountains. I threw an overnight bag into the back seat, along with my interview pack and a few bags of groceries, snacks, and wine. With the car loaded, I was off. I drove up the highway, snaking my way into the mountains of North Carolina, sunroof open to smell the sweet scent of rhododendron as I progressed upward. I tuned into a favorite local radio station, WNCW, and spent the journey listening to bluegrass and folk music of the mountain. I was in my element. The drive took almost 3 hours. During the last half hour or so, I lost cell service and my GPS signal. But I navigated the back roads with a paper map, arriving only 15 minutes late. When I finally pulled into Ethel's gravel drive, she was waiting for me on the porch in a weathered rocking chair, a faded knit cardigan covering her legs. "Hi there," I called after exiting the car and stretching my back. Ethel responded with a rock forward in her chair and an "mm-hmm" as she moved to stand up and walk into the house. "Come on inside," she called behind her. I noticed she was surprisingly limber for someone in their 90s. As I followed her in the house, I let the screen door slam behind me, and she motioned for me to sit before heading into the kitchen. "Y'all want some tea?" she asked from the other room. "No, ma'am. I'm okay with water for the interview," I replied, as I began unpacking my interview bag. I was setting up the recorder and the external mic, checking the batteries and volume, when she sauntered back to the sitting room with a glass of cold sweet tea in one hand and a water in the other. She sat in a worn cloth chair which engulfed her large frame. "So," she said, staring at me intently, "you're here to listen to me blether about growing up on this here mountain." "Yes, ma'am," I said. "That's exactly right, and specifically what it was like to sharecrop as a family in the 1930s. She paused, continuing to look at me. "I've got to say, I'm really excited about this, Ethel," I added. "Your family worked the land a long time, and I think your story is important to capture." She took a long sip of her tea. "All right then," she sighed. "What you want to know?" Ethel had amazing insight into the topic. She talked about the family farm. They were sharecrop farmers, as most folk in Appalachia were in those days. She picked cotton from the age of 5, tending the hogs and chicken with her 7 brothers and sisters. She told me about her responsibilities, the things she did with the little bit of leisure time they were given. She told me how she helped make the children's clothing from old feed sacks, and how she and her sisters made dolls out of sticks and twine. And she told me about her father, who helped 2 other local men make moonshine deep in the holler beyond her house. Her favorite time of year was Christmas, the only time the children got oranges, some nuts, and a bit of chocolate as Christmas gifts. I was fascinated by her history growing up in the area, and would have happily kept listening for hours. In a lull between stories, I asked, "Did all the children have jobs on the farm? It must have been a bit easier with 7 of you sharing the work." Ethel paused for a minute, looking away from me, toward the door. As an oral historian, we're trained to let people sit with their thoughts, to not interrupt, so I waited for her. After a long pause, she reflected. Really, there were only 6 of us, not 7. You can't count Clyde. In fact, we never really talked about Clyde after the accident. I paused for a moment myself, waiting for Ethel to pick up the story, but she was silent. I wasn't surprised she had lost a sibling. Hell, it was surprising 6 of the 7 had made it past infancy, given the time period and the mortality rate in Appalachia. However, something in her silence put me on edge. I waited about 30 seconds before asking, Ethel, can you tell me about your brother Clyde? Ethel placed her glass of tea on the end table, not meeting my eye. She was staring down, avoiding eye contact with me. It's a shame, really. He just didn't believe Daddy, or maybe that day he just didn't want to listen. I don't know. But he stayed out after dark, and he never came back. Ethel's face depicted a mix of regret and sadness. The memory had cast a shadow over her, and really the entire room. However, this was the kind of memory that I'm trained to follow up on, although I think the key driving factor at this point was my own curiosity. Ethel, I said, I would really like to know more about Clyde, if you're all right talking about it. She looked at me hard, with a bit of judgment, I thought. You didn't grow up in these mountains. You don't know the legends. She said it curtly, and there was a subsequent pause between us. Nah, not just the legends, she said, but the rules of what folks can and can't do. The rules that keep the balance and the harmony and keep folks safe. I was a little self-conscious, because as much as I felt I was an insider into this community, clearly she didn't see me like that. So I acknowledged her observation and asked, Can you tell me about the legends and about these rules? This wasn't what I'd come for. I was supposed to find out about her childhood and about sharecropping, about her life beyond the farm. But I couldn't help but follow up on this question, my own curiosity and intrigue guiding me. Listen, child, there are rules to these mountains. You don't pay mind to things, you hear? If you seen something, no you didn't. If you heard something, no you didn't. You just keep walking and you keep ignoring it, and you never run, and you never look back. Clyde knew that. We all knew that. But when you're a youngin', when you're just a boy, you don't know no better. Clyde was just a boy, really. He stayed out too long and the moon-faced people knowed it. I suddenly realized how cold and uncomfortable I felt. It was like a cold snap had engulfed the room. I had chills and suddenly felt completely underdressed for a visit to an old lady's living room. The moon-faced people? That was a new one. I racked my brain for a connection to local folklore and legend, but I had nothing. I had no idea what she was talking about. She saw it in my face, though. I must have looked confused, like I was trying to place something that I had no connection to. She countered my confusion with an explanation, possibly in the same language her mother and father used with her and the other children. Yes, the moon-faced people. They were here well before us. The Cherokee have legends. They're only about at night with their big eyes and little bodies. They hide in the caves during the day, and they don't take no disrespect. If you stay out at night and they find you, you ain't coming back. She sat further back in her chair, reaching for her glass of tea. And you think they had something to do with Clyde disappearing? I asked cautiously. Well, of course they did, she quipped. Clyde was only about 10. He would go and play with the Simon boys 3 farms over when they had some time, but he had to cross the creek down the bottom of the holler, and he knew he had to start back home before the sun went down. Me and my younger sisters were too little to venture that far, and you know how it was. Boys were men when they was born, let to do anything. So me and my sisters would stay behind. We'd build fairy houses out of moss and stones, and we played in the yard till Mama called us in for supper, or until Clyde got back. But that night, it was sometime in the fall, before the cold snaps at night, and that night, Clyde didn't come back for supper. Daddy waited a while before he set out with our old dog and his shotgun, and I remember thinking, that gun ain't no good. The moon-faced people got him now, and he ain't coming back. Ethel looked defeated, but she sighed and sat up a little straighter, with a "what can you do" type of expression on her face. So he never turned up? Your father didn't find anything? I asked. Nope. The Simon boys said he'd left their farm that night. Later than usual, mind, but not that late. Daddy looked all through the woods, and some local folks joined in as well, but for 3 days, they didn't find nothing. Then, they found his body, floating in one of the creek pools. Said he'd drowned. Maybe he slipped and fell in trying to get home, but I knowed better. Clyde was tough. He knew these mountains. He could swim better than any of us. It was the moon-faced people. Maybe he didn't follow the rules. Might have tried to run. Maybe he took a shortcut somewhere he ain't ought to be. Maybe he tried to talk to him. That's all it takes, you know. And do you know, none of us kids ventured off the farm for the next year at least. Mama's rules. Only Daddy went up to the still with the old dog. We was careful, and we let them know that's their territory, and we ain't up to trespassing it. Ethel and I had been talking for hours at this point, and she seemed tired. She finished her tea, and after a long swallow, she said, "We didn't talk about Clyde after that year. It wasn't 'cause we didn't miss him. We was busy, you know. Daddy had lost him a farmhand, and us girls had to start doing more of the farm work. It was a hard year. But soon enough, my 3 youngest brothers came along, and we just moved on with life. Wasn't much else to do back then." That seemed to be the end of the story for Ethel, almost like she wasn't willing to discuss it further or to take more questions on the subject. I knew it was time for me to leave. I looked for a way to start wrapping things up, thanking her for her time and telling her I'd let her get back to her evening. I packed my bag with the recorder and microphone, taking the glasses back to the kitchen for her. She stood up to walk me to the door, but didn't come out onto the porch, stopping at the screen door instead. I turned around on her porch steps to tell her thank you again, but she wasn't looking at me. She was looking into the woods around her house. "Our farm was just through them there trees, about half an hour's walk. I ain't never walked down to where they found Clyde, but it ain't far. That creek runs down from Tennessee and through the whole county and more. There's crags and caves in some of the gullies too. Best not to disturb any of those, 'cause that's where they hide during the day." With that, her attention snapped back to me, and she looked up to the sky. "Time you get on down the road. Shouldn't be talking about them no more. It'll be pure dark soon." I pulled my glance away from the woods, curious about the farm she'd spent the afternoon talking about. I let her know. "Oh, it's no problem, Ethel. I'm just heading down the road a bit to my grandparents' cabin for the night. I don't have very far to go, actually. Nothing like the trek up the mountain anyway. But you have a great night. I'll be in touch about the exhibit progress." I was walking toward my car when she asked, "Where's your folks' place?" "Oh, we're just over Linville Way. I'll be there for the weekend, then I'll be heading back down the mountain on Sunday." Her eyebrows furrowed for a moment, but then she gave me a wave and said, "All right then." She turned to go back into her house, pausing with her back to the screen door. "Just be careful if you're staying round here," she said over her shoulder. "Remember what I was telling about the rules and all that?" And with that word of warning, she walked into the house, closing the front door behind her. I thought about Ethel's story during the drive over to the cabin. Not so much the sharecropping bit, but the beliefs passed down through what was bound to be generations of mountain folk. Beliefs so real to them that they were used to explain a child's death and keep the other kids at home for a year. And what in the hell were moon-faced people? I was buzzing with excitement when I finally made it to the cabin. I put away my overnight bag and unloaded the groceries in the kitchen cabinets and fridge. I settled in on the couch with a glass of wine and a poor excuse for a charcuterie board, cobbled together from things I'd brought up the mountain, and a block of cheese purchased on a roadside stand I'd passed coming into town. Between bites of cheese and crackers, I was researching moon-faced people in Appalachia, absorbing anything I could about these entities fresh on my radar. The creatures Ethel called moon-faced people were actually the moon-eyed people, an ancient Cherokee legend. Creatures with short, small bodies, white skin, and perhaps blue eyes, but noticeably flat faces with large hollows around the eyes. Some say they're a Native American interpretation of seeing European settlers for the first time, but other sources put the moon-eyed people in the region well before the Cherokee made it their home. They're said to reside in caves during the day because of their light skin, only emerging at night, navigating by the light of the moon. Even more interesting to me was the statue that was unearthed in the 1840s of moon-eyed people. It was found in Butler, North Carolina, on what would have marked a prominent road during the Trail of Tears, when Native Americans were displaced from their homelands and forced to relocate to the west, often on foot. More archaeological evidence supposedly sits in Georgia, at Fort Mountain State Park, where an erected stone wall is attributed to the moon-eyed people, built as protection from the Cherokee. I stayed glued to my computer for another hour, reading everything I could find, although most sites and stories just corroborated each other. Cherokee legend, small people, possibly blue eyes, but definitely round hollow eye areas. Only come out at night due to light sensitivity and live in caves. One thing that did baffle me was the locality of these stories. They spanned the westernmost portions of North Carolina, around Cherokee County, into Georgia and Tennessee. Ethel's family resided hours from this area, and that was with modern roads. The legend had obviously traveled throughout the mountain region by word of mouth. My research was interrupted after about an hour by a phone call from my mother. "Hi, honey. How did the interview go?" I grabbed my cigarettes and lighter and an old heavy coat hanging by the door before heading out to the porch to speak to her. "It went really well. Fascinating, even," I said, as I plopped into one of the rocking chairs, overlooking the steep gorge behind the house. "The sharecropping stories will be perfect for the exhibit, and I've asked her to see if she can find old photos to better represent the family. You know, give a face to the voice telling the story. That kind of thing. She's gonna get back to me on that next week." Mom seemed pleased it went well, and started to change the subject to discussions around what we would make for Sunday lunch, when I stopped her. "Mom, there's one more thing, though. The end of the interview was, well, I don't know. Maybe spooky is the right word." "What do you mean?" she asked. I took a long drag from my cigarette, then launched into the story Ethel had told about her brother Clyde and the moon-faced people. I told her about the harmony that supposedly existed between folks on the mountain and these entities, about Ethel's warnings and about the rules. I then explained what I'd found in the few hours of research I was able to do before she called. I mean, there are actual statues, Mom. I even thought about driving out to the museum in Butler tomorrow to see this thing in real life. Can you imagine uncovering such an artifact in your own backyard, knowing it was left behind during one of the most horrific events of ethnic cleansing in American history? It's just wild. Well, my mother didn't seem to know exactly how to respond to all this. She couldn't have told her story to a more interested party, I'll give you that. But you know, Leigh, you're up there by yourself this weekend. Maybe you should shelf any other research until you're back home. I don't want you winding yourself up. Besides, you know how mountain folk can be. It's all superstition built around teaching kids lessons. These moon people, or whatever they're called. It's just a way to warn their kids to be home on time, not to stay out after dark, advise against entering caves, those sorts of things. I was a little annoyed at her reaction. She knew I was passionate about any folklore-related topics, yet it felt like I was being brushed off. I finished my cigarette and pulled my jacket closer. The wind was starting to blow colder through the trees. Right, well, I'm gonna head inside now and finish my glass of wine. Might just call it an early night. Besides, the wind is picking up and I'm freezing out on this porch. She sighed. All right. She could tell I was annoyed with her response. Well, have a good night and I'll speak to you later. Make sure you wake up in time that you're not late for Sunday lunch, too. Got it, Mom. I'll see you soon. I hung up the phone in a huff. Despite the cold, I wasn't really ready to go inside yet. I stood up, lighting another cigarette and walking over to the balcony edge. The gorge below was steep, but the house was built to make use of its depth and natural beauty. When they first bought the house, we were all scared of falling off the balcony and into that gully, and the adults took extra measures to make sure the smaller kids did not go near the edge. It wasn't terribly deep, though. You could see the bottom, covered in limbs and leaves, and my cousins and I used to vow we were going to find the other side one day. The opening couldn't be far, and we were sure it led to caves and curiosities, but we never attempted to find it. Without thinking, I looked down and yelled a loud, "Hello!" into the gorge. It was too windy to hear much of an echo. I yelled again, "Hello!" But all I heard were trees rustling in the wind. I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of the forest, enjoying the cold against my face. I finished my cigarette while leaning against the porch railing, looking up at the sky. It was a dark night, too cloudy to see stars. I turned back to the gorge momentarily, ready to get inside, into the warmth, when something caught my eye. I paused and tried to concentrate my stare on the pale thing at the bottom of the gorge. It was roundish, with an almost iridescent coloring. It wasn't bright, just pale. And moving? Was it moving? The thing was shifting itself as if it were walking. At times I could make out the roundish head. Then it would disappear into the side of the gorge nearest me, blocking it from view. I stood there another 2 minutes, watching it saunter along at the bottom of the gorge. It was so dark, I could only make out its movements from the pale, hazy light it cast. It wasn't moving fast, and at first it reminded me of a deer sauntering through the forest, stopping to nibble at grass, in no hurry to move on. Just as that thought entered my mind, just as I thought, there's no way this can be a deer, the figure disappeared into the left side of the embankment, and it was gone. I waited another few minutes, but I saw nothing. I was suddenly so cold, chilled from the wind, but also by this thing. This dull moving light at the bottom of a gorge that was, from my understanding, inaccessible for miles. Maybe my mom had a point, and I had just creeped myself out. That, coupled with staying alone in the cabin, probably caused me to see something that wasn't actually there. With a shiver, I grabbed my cigarettes and moved to walk inside the cabin, giving one last glance to the gorge, but seeing nothing but darkness. I decided to put away my laptop for the night. Turning on the TV for a distraction, I settled onto the couch with a blanket and a glass of wine. I found a romantic comedy I'd seen about a dozen times and tried to let it distract me from my thoughts of those moon-eyed people, and from whatever I just saw. My mind raced through the possibility that I'd just seen some sort of animal, that maybe it wasn't as cloudy as I'd thought. Maybe the moonlight managed to illuminate portions of the gorge, and that's what I equated to its movement. But none of the explanations made sense. After my third glass of wine, and with lower inhibitions, I decided to heck with this. I should be able to go back out onto the porch and have a cigarette. Moon-eyed people be damned. Once again, I grabbed the heavy coat from the rack, stuck my cigarettes and lighter into the pocket, and opened the porch door. It was quieter now. The wind had died down a bit, and I could hear the sounds of the forest around me. I settled into my rocking chair, deliberately looking away from the gorge. I lit my cigarette and began rocking, my eyes fixed on the opposite side of the porch, toward my parked car. The squeak of the rocking chair was calming as I rocked back and forth, lulling myself into a sense of calm where I was safe. Where I was in the mountains surrounded by forest and scents of fresh fauna, at my family's favorite place. I was remembering a particularly fond family cookout on that very porch when I heard it. Someone somewhere said my name.
Lay!
My whole body tensed as I abruptly stopped rocking. I sat completely still, letting my cigarette burn as I listened closely. I heard it again, quietly, almost like a whisper. I heard a pleading voice call, Lay. My one-syllable name was elongated to 3 or 4 seconds. Its tone begged me to respond, almost as though it were in pain, almost as though it needed my help. I felt my heart beating hard in my chest. My body was tense as I sat as still and as quiet as possible. I sat this way for minutes without hearing a sound outside of the rustle of wind in the trees. It was long enough that I started disputing with myself that I'd heard anything at all. Maybe it was just the wind. Wasn't that what people always said when they heard sounds in the woods while alone? The tension had subsided with the passing time, and I could feel my body giving up its rigidity of the last 5 minutes when I heard the name again. This time it was fast and angry, and it was louder.
Lay!
It seemed to be coming from all sides of the gorge. I couldn't place it as I hurriedly stood up, knocking over the side table next to me. I hesitantly looked over the balcony for the source of the sound, or for the pale light, for anything that might explain what I'd heard and seen this evening. Soon, I saw it, straight across from me. Not in the gorge any longer, but on the opposite side, directly across from me. It was pale with a round face and hollows for eyes. It was a short humanoid form, slight in build, but I could make out the legs and arms for the first time. I froze. Maybe it was the wine, but I felt as though I could not move, like my brain was trying to register what it was seeing. I was staring at this thing, trying to make sense of what it could be. But then it started to move. It was walking, slowly, parallel to the porch, with just the opening of the gorge between us. A rush of panic flooded my senses, and I opened my mouth to scream. I almost choked on the sound, trying to escape my lungs, when a dawning recognition struck. I remembered Ethel's warning. I remembered the rules. And I remembered what happened when Clyde didn't follow them. You don't pay mind to things you hear. If you seen something, no you didn't. If you heard something, no you didn't. You just keep walking, and you ignore it, and you never run, and you never look back. My thoughts were flooded with the realization that I'd spoken about the moon-eyed people aloud, on the porch, to my mother. I shared the deep Appalachian folklore passed down quietly through families for generations. I went so far as to question their existence on that call, to share I was doing research in an effort to understand where this myth, this folklore, originated. I spoke about artifacts being found and historical connections throughout the region. My mind recalled all the talking points. What exactly had I said? Did I do something to draw them to me? The gorge would be the perfect place for them. Dark and cavernous, with so little access from the outside world, so little reach for the sun's rays. I was still staring at the figure as it continued to walk, its pale form navigating the ridge slowly and deliberately. Its pale face was turned toward me as it walked, with little attention to the forest floor. Outwardly, I was shaking. I'd crossed my arms, hugging my torso for comfort. I felt sick. My mind was racing, but I managed to pull my thoughts together to try to be practical. Right, I thought. I didn't actually see it, and I didn't actually hear anything. I'll turn around, walk back into the cabin, and just lock up for the night. I'll pull the blinds and barricade myself in the master bedroom. All I need is the morning light. All I need is to wait it out until morning. As it continued to walk slowly along the ridge, I turned away, pulling my gaze from the creature. I began to calmly walk inside. I locked the porch door behind me, lowering the small blind on the door's glass. I went into the living room, with its high ceilings and tall windows built for the morning sunlight. The room felt unsafe now, with clear views of the road leading to the cabin. I turned off the TV, pulling the curtains on the first-floor windows, the only curtains available to close. I continued this throughout the first floor, closing the kitchen blinds, the ones in the small dining room. I left the light on, and all the lamps. Then I made my way to the master bedroom on the second floor. The master had a small balcony overlooking the gorge as well. In fact, all the bedrooms overlooked the gorge, facing the back of the house. I locked myself inside the room, then made sure the door to the balcony was locked. I pulled the curtains tight against the balcony door and sat on the bed, my heart pounding. But my adrenaline was starting to wane. It was approaching midnight at this point, and having drank a bottle of wine with cheese and crackers for supper, my eyes were growing heavy, regardless of my pounding heart. I did not want to fall asleep, even though I was exhausted. I quickly turned on all 3 lamps in the room for more light, hoping that this would deter anything from trying to come into the house. The moon-eyed people couldn't stand light, so surely I was safe in a lamp-lit bedroom. I crawled under my covers, my phone in hand in case of an emergency, and I waited. For half an hour, nothing happened. No calls of my name or even loud whistling of the wind. Eventually, my exhaustion won out, and I fell asleep at some point. The bedside alarm clock read 3:22 when I awoke in the dark. I was confused as to where I was for a moment, looking around the dark bedroom for something familiar. Then the situation rushed back to me, and I sat straight up. All 3 lights, my beacons of hope and saving grace, had been switched off. Was it a power cut? It couldn't be. The alarm clock still worked. Then I noticed the light of the moon. It was pouring in through the glass balcony doors. The clouds must have dissipated at some point in the night. I scrambled to the left side of the bed, as far away from the balcony doors I could get, looking in terror as the moonlight streamed in. The electricity is one thing, but I distinctly remembered closing the curtains. They were my protection against seeing the moon-eyed people again, against seeing the gorge at all. I began to shake with panic. My phone lay on the bed, feet away from me. But who would I call? What would I even tell someone if I called? I was being targeted by what? A Cherokee legend? I tried the bedside lamp. The switch clicked on and off, but no light. If the electricity was out, maybe my phone had enough battery to provide some light. If I could grab my phone and turn on the flashlight, I could potentially dash to the balcony, close the curtains again, and check the lock on the bedroom door. Then it was only 2.5 hours until sunrise. I was sure I could stay alert for 2.5 hours. I crawled along the bed to grab my phone, then quickly ambled to the left side as far away from the balcony as possible. 30% battery. A relief flooded over me. I switched it on and left it face down on the side table, illuminating most of the room. I took a few deep breaths, trying to muster the courage to run to the balcony door. I waited a few minutes, listening intently and hearing nothing before I finally convinced myself to move. In a mad dash, I jumped off the bed, running to the balcony door to pull the curtains. I got the right curtain closed, and I went to grab the left, when that pale light caught my eye again. It was below me, standing next to the rocking chair I'd left just a few hours ago. The moon-eyed thing. I could see it now a little better. Still a humanoid figure with distinct arms and legs. It was just a body though, no clothing, but small in stature, maybe 3.5 feet high. Its whole body was glowing pale, but its face was so wrong. It was very round with no discernible mouth. The most striking feature were those hollow eyes, almost gape-like, and I couldn't see anything but holes. It was standing adjacent to the porch door, beside the rocking chair, in the exact spot I'd stood while watching it walk parallel to the gorge, and now it was staring straight up at my balcony doors. It wasn't a full moon, and I only looked for a few seconds, but that image, that feeling of invasiveness, that it had invaded my property, my sense of safety, and that it knew which room I was currently in, that feeling will never leave me. I jerked the left side of the curtains closed and threw myself onto the bed, crying uncontrollably. How had it made it to my porch? That gully stretched throughout the valley, and I was unaware of where to even cross it. More so, what the hell had I done to draw these things to me? With that thought, I started to imagine what Clyde could have possibly done to anger these moon-eyed people. Had he seen the same thing I was seeing now? Clyde, whose story had brought us here, and Ethel, who shared a family legend, some mountain folklore, then me, who stupidly repeated it all out loud into the gorge. I stayed curled up against the top of the bed frame for what felt like an hour, with only the phone illuminating the room. Soon it would be morning, I kept telling myself. Soon this will all be over, and I can go home, and I will swear off this whole region. I would stay happily in the Piedmont, avoiding any cave or gorge or dark forest for the rest of my life, if I could only survive this night. I hugged my legs and cried. I cried until I eventually fell asleep, sometime after 4 a.m. I awoke to light streaming in through the balcony curtains. It was the soft sunlight of dawn, and the illumination around the curtain's edges was the most incredible sight of my life. My eyes were puffy and irritated from crying, but I got up off the bed and slowly opened the curtains. It was a gorgeous morning. The gorge and ridge surrounding the cabin were glowing with the morning sun, illuminating trees just beginning to turn to their autumnal reds and golds, and a slight dusting of frost on the ground below. I slowly peeled the curtains back and looked down at the porch. The rocking chair sat motionless, the side table still overturned. But other than that, it was just as I'd left it last night. There were no signs, or not that I could see from above, of the moon-eyed people. I fully opened the curtains, then tried the bedside lamp. It turned on at the click of the switch. So did the lamp in the corner, and the one on the desk. The electricity was working just fine. I sat down on the edge of the bed, confused, and with a bit of a headache. I remembered everything so vividly. I saw something in that gorge. It then reappeared out of the gorge, on the other side of the embankment, and it terrified me by coming onto my porch, standing exactly where I'd been when I first glimpsed it, staring up at me, up at my bedroom. All of it never felt like a dream, and I never doubted it. I had been more scared than I'd ever been in my life after seeing it, and that is not something you simply dream. It was that moment that I flew into action. I splashed some water on my face and began packing my toiletries. I'd hardly unpacked my overnight bag, but I changed into my leggings and a sweatshirt, throwing my pajamas into the bag. I grabbed my phone and its charger, and I took the stairs 2 by 2. As soon as I reached the landing, it hit me. It was incredibly bright in the living room. I glanced around and realized that every single curtain and blind that I'd closed were now completely open. The large windows in the living room were fully visible, streaming in the morning sunlight. The curtains I'd closed last night, the ones covering the ground floor glass, were open. The kitchen and dining room too. Even the small shade covering the porch door was pulled open. It was as though it was sending a sign that I hadn't been safe from them, and that the light was no obstacle at night. That same anxious adrenaline flooded me again as I set my bag on the couch. I tried the lamp in the living room. It worked, clicking on and off. My initial thoughts were validated. It wasn't electrical. There was no outage. This was something else. This was a targeted attack on the lamps in my bedroom that somehow stopped once it was light outside. This was a message meant to warn me, to show me that I had somehow trespassed or disrespected these people. I stood another few minutes just gazing around the room, thinking about the curtains, about the lights, when I decided it was time to get the heck out of this house. I grabbed the few groceries I had stored in the kitchen, shoving them into grocery bags. I left the wine glass and plate in the kitchen sink, not wanting to stay long enough to wash and put them away. I was at the front door in under 2 minutes, grabbing my keys as I reached for the handle. I turned the knob and opened it when I stopped. The door was unlocked, even the deadbolt, which I had absolutely locked when I came back from my interview with Ethel. My hands were shaking as I pulled open the door and bolted out. I locked both locks, taking the stairs 2 by 2 down to my car. It was 6:50 a.m. when I started my car and began reversing down the drive. There would be no museum visit for me, and I definitely would not be staying around long enough to visit the national park, quaint town, or the immensely popular attraction, the Linville Gorge. I was done with the Blue Ridge Mountains, and more of a believer than I'd ever been. I called Ethel the next week to follow up on our conversation. I thanked her again, noting how invaluable it would be to preserve her memory of mountain life. We exchanged pleasantries for as long as was comfortable, and I was ready to end that call and my ties to Ethel when she remarked, "Those stories about Clyde, those memories I tell to you, you can't use them for the museum." I wasn't surprised. Narrators often have objections to certain things shared in the heat of the moment. I assured her, "Oh no, Ethel, those stories aren't really relevant here. In fact, if you wanted me to remove them from the interview audio itself, I can do that. You can still archive your interview, but we won't include those portions, as they're quite personal to you." "Ain't because they're personal, eh?" I was surprised at how exasperated she seemed, and a little confused. "We can't be talking about them, that's all. I don't know if I should have even told you." "Right," I said. I knew exactly what she meant. I knew more than she could have ever imagined. I said uneasily, "By the way, Ethel, I had an experience at my grandparents' house after I left our interview." She was completely silent. "I was just wondering if you thought maybe—" She cut me off. "If you seen something, no you didn't. If you heard something, no you didn't. I hope to God you just kept walking and you ignored it, and that you didn't run, and you never looked back. That's all I'm gonna say on that. Some of us folks still have to live in these here hollers." I had nothing to say except, "Yes, ma'am." With that, our call ended, and I never ever spoke openly about the Moonite people again. My mom tried to follow up at Sunday lunch, asking why I'd ended my trip early and how the research was going. I let her know it was a bit of a disappointment, that I'd found nothing else, and it seemed it was just a legend after all. In fact, I announced I don't even think Ethel was speaking about the same folklore or legend I'd found. None of it added up, but that was all a lie. There was nothing to the stories at all, I lied. My family feigned interest for all of 20 minutes, but the topic was never broached again. As for that house, the mountain house, I didn't return for any family gatherings for the next 3 years. By 2018, my grandparents had decided to list it. While I was sad that part of my life would be gone, I was also relieved. I had an excuse to never step foot on that mountain again, and to never have to see that gorge. I moved to Scotland 6 years ago, and it's only now I feel comfortable sharing anything about this encounter. I'm still not sure what exactly those things were, because I stopped researching, and I stopped searching for answers. I amended the audio before giving it to the museum, so no one has ever heard Ethel's story, and I never spoke about it to anyone aside from my mom. I share this mostly to document a legend that I'd never heard of, but has now fundamentally shaped my life because I did not listen to the advice given to me. I also share it out of respect for the rules and the harmony that folks in the Appalachian Mountains have lived by for decades. I still love to read about North Carolina history, and I miss the beauty of the Blue Ridge Parkway in the fall. But thoughts of that region beyond that fill me with anxiety and dread. So, please, learn from my experience before careless actions leave you with the most traumatic experience of your life. Don't sweep folklore and legends under the rug of fiction. Often these stories linger because they serve an important purpose. Maybe it's to warn folks about staying out after dark or traveling dangerous paths. Sometimes, however, it's a reminder that we share this world with beings that wish to be left alone, lest you suffer a painful price. Good night. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. And if you want more of my scary story narrations, find my other show, Unexplained Encounters, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Also, you can send me your scary work stories at eriecast.com/submit. Till next time, everyone, I'd better clock out. But I'll be clocking in again real soon. My God, get ready, because this story scared even me. It almost made me regret living in the Ozarks. This story is titled Box Fan and was sent to me by a viewer named simply Jeb. In it, he recalls a series of bizarre childhood rules and events at his grandparents' mountain home in the Ozarks, which ultimately led to the most traumatic moment in his life, the moment he realized monsters are real. This is the Unexplained Encounters podcast. I sleep with the fan on every single night, regardless of the reason, no matter the temperature. A box fan runs on the floor next to my bed at full speed. My wife thinks it's a white noise thing, something to help me sleep. She's gotten used to it over the years. She bought me one of those sound machines for Christmas a couple years back. It plays ocean waves and rain and all that stuff, and I thanked her. But I put it in the closet and kept on using the fan. She never asked why, but I'm sure she wondered. I think she could tell by my face that I didn't want to explain. I'm 34 years old. I've slept with a box fan on since I was 11, and I'll probably sleep with one on until the day I die. This is not a comfort thing. At least, not in the way you expect. I've never told anyone the full version of what I'm about to write down. Not even my wife. I've explained parts, yeah, like during a particularly bad night terror that had me standing in the hallway at 3 a.m. with my hands against the wall, like I was bracing for something to hit the house, and my wife found me there, asking what I'd been dreaming about. I didn't remember, I said, but that was a lie. Not too long ago, my grandfather passed away. He was 91 years old, lived a full life, and had been in a wheelchair for the last 12 years. A stroke had taken most of his left side. At the funeral, I was standing by the coffee and those little crustless sandwiches that only exist at church receptions when my cousin Parker walked up, and without any preamble or greeting, he leaned in and said, "You remember that night?" It wasn't a question, and I didn't treat it like one. I simply nodded, and we stood still for a while, until his wife called him over to deal with one of his kids, and that was it. We haven't talked about it since, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't shake something loose. So here it is. My grandfather owned 130 acres in the Ozarks. Most of it backed up to Mark Twain National Forest land, in a part of southern Missouri where the nearest grocery store was a 40-minute drive, and the nearest hospital was further than that. He had retired from the Missouri Pacific Railroad before I was born, and he spent his days doing whatever he wanted on that land, which mostly meant tinkering with small engines and sitting on his porch, growing tomatoes that he'd give away to anyone who stopped by. He was no farmer, though people sometimes assumed he was. He just had land, and he liked having it, and he kept it the way some men keep their guns, maintained and ready, though ready for what was never entirely clear to me as a child. The house was old, but solid. He and my grandmother had built it in 1961 with money he'd saved from the railroad, and it looked like what it was. A post-war rural home designed by people who valued function but had a limited interest in aesthetics. Single-story, partial basement, wood-paneled walls inside that had darkened over the decades to the color of strong tea. It smelled of coffee grounds and something chemically that I eventually identified as mothballs, which were stuffed into the closets. The porch wrapped around two sides and had a concrete floor that was always gritty underfoot. There were 2 rocking chairs out there that had worn smooth grooves into the concrete from decades of use. The property itself was mostly open yard around the house, maybe 2 acres of mowed grass, then the tree line on 3 sides. The 4th side was the gravel driveway, a quarter-mile of loose rock that popped under tires and announced every arrival long before you could see the vehicle. Beyond the driveway was just more trees. A barn sat about 200 yards from the house, listing to the south. It had stayed like that for as long as I'd been alive, as though it had decided 30 years ago how far it was willing to lean and had just committed to it. There was a creek that cut through the back portion of the property, where the woods thickened up, and in the summer it ran shallow enough to wade in, and deep enough in a few spots to sit down in, up to your chest. Every summer, my parents sent me and my cousins out there for 2 or 3 weeks. Parker was 2 years older than me, fearless, in a stupid way, and I say that with the most love possible. Leia was my age, quiet, and loved reading books more than anything. Sometimes baby Derek would come too. He was Aunt Diane's youngest, maybe 4 or 5 years old during the years I'm talking about, but he was mostly just a background presence, trailing after the rest of us and crying when he couldn't keep up. During the day, that property was the best place on earth. I genuinely believed that. We had the run of the entire 100+ acres, and we used every inch of it. I remember catching crawdads in the creek with our bare hands, racing them on the flat rocks. We explored that barn hundreds of times, which was full of old equipment and barn swallows, and rusty junk that felt like pirate treasure to a 9-year-old. Grandpa even had an old 3-wheeler ATV. Yeah, if you didn't know, you could get a 3-wheeler back then. They were a bit more common than what you might see today, because they were soon considered way too dangerous. But back then he would let Parker drive it around the property while the rest of us clung to the back like it was a mechanical bull. Grandma kept a drawer in the kitchen full of candy too. Off-brand candy though, mostly. Most of it being butterscotch discs and peppermints. But occasionally, if you're lucky, there would be Snickers in there, hidden away specifically for the kids. Those really were the good days. I want to be clear about that. Those days were genuinely wonderful. It was the nights that were different. I've spent a long time trying to articulate exactly how the shift happened each evening, and the best I can describe it is that my grandfather had an internal clock that the rest of us could not see or hear, and around 5 or 6 o'clock every day, it would go off, and he would become a different person. Now hold on there, he didn't get mean, he didn't yell or become harsh. He just sort of went somewhere else inside himself. You could see it in the way he moved. He would straighten up from whatever he was doing, and his eyes would go to the sky like he was reading something written up there in a language meant just for him. His jaw would start to clench repeatedly, and then he would herd all the kids inside. The rule was that we had to be in the house before the first star appeared in the sky. Not before sunset, which would have been reasonable, but before the first star. In June in Missouri, the sun doesn't fully set until around 9 o'clock, but the first stars can show up in the east while the western sky is still pale. And Grandpa knew this. He watched for them every night with a patience that bordered on obsession. He would sit on the porch in his rocking chair and face east, just waiting. And the moment he saw that first pinpoint of light, wherever we were on the property, he wanted us inside. If we were down at the creek, he'd ring the iron bell mounted on the porch post. A real cast iron bell, too, the kind you would see at old schoolhouses, and you could hear it across the entire property. That sound meant now. It did not mean start heading back. It didn't mean get an attitude or argue. It meant get your butt inside. Once inside, the house changed too. Grandpa would go room to room pulling down the blinds, and these were not typical blinds. Every window in that house had thick, opaque roller shades, the heavy kind that you might find in a dark room or a hospital room where a patient needed total darkness. They were mounted inside the window frames, and when you pulled them down, they sealed the glass almost completely. No light got in, and I suppose more importantly, no light got out. He pulled every single one of them down every single night, without exception, and we were not allowed to raise them or peek behind them until morning. He never explained why. It was simply the rule, and in that house, His rules had the weight of physics. You didn't question gravity, and you didn't question Grandpa. The doors were another thing. He had a deadbolt on every exterior door, which, for a rural house in the middle of nowhere, was already unusual. But the front door also had a chain lock and a sliding barrel bolt that he had installed himself, a heavy steel piece that seated into a bracket that he had lag bolted directly onto the door frame. Every night, I'd hear him making his rounds. The back door first, then the side door off the kitchen, then the front. Click, click, thunk, slide. The same order every time. The sounds of the house being sealed. And then there were the fans. Every bedroom had a box fan. The cheap kind you could grab at a hardware store for $12 or so, with plastic blades and a rattling motor, and 3 speed settings that were basically loud, louder, and broken sounding. In the room where the kids slept, a guest room with 2 twin beds and a folding cot, Grandpa would set the fan on a wooden chair between the beds and turn it on high before we went to bed. It roared. It pushed air around that didn't need pushing. The house did have central air conditioning that worked fine. The fan would dry out your eyes and your throat so that by morning you'd wake up feeling like you slept in a kiln. Parker hated it and complained about it every summer. Leia slept with a pillow over her face to block the wind. I would just pull the sheet up to my nose and breathed through the fabric, and I dealt with it. One summer, Parker asked Grandma directly why we had to sleep with the fans on. She said the house got stuffy at night and the fans helped circulate the air. Parker pointed out that the air conditioning was literally running, and Grandma gave him a look that was pleasant on the surface, but had something underneath it. Something that communicated very clearly that this line of questioning was finished. Then she said, "Your grandpa likes the fans on, so the fans stay on." And that they did. I understand now what the fans were for. I've understood this since I was 11. The fans were loud enough to cover the sounds from outside. Almost. That was their entire purpose. They were there so it was harder to hear what was walking around the house at night. I should tell you about the moon. There's a specific memory I keep coming back to, from a summer when I was 8 or maybe 9 years old. I was sitting on the porch with Grandpa after dinner, while the sky was doing its long summer fade from orange to purple, and the moon was rising in the east, enormous and nearly full, a deep amber color. I said something about it, like, "Look at that moon," or maybe, "The moon's huge tonight." At first, I didn't think my grandpa was going to say anything. He rocked in his chair and looked at the moon, and he didn't look happy about it, like I was. Eventually, he said to me, as if I wasn't even there, "I hate that damned thing." I thought he was joking around. I even laughed, but it came out awkward and forced. He didn't laugh. Over the years, I started to notice a pattern without fully understanding it. Grandpa was worse on certain nights, and it took me a long time to connect those nights to the moon because I was a kid and I wasn't tracking lunar cycles for fun. But looking back, the pattern was unmistakable. On nights when the moon was full, he was tense and vigilant, more alert than usual and more watchful, up later than Grandma. On nights where there was no moon at all, when the sky was just a black field of stars with no light to speak of, he was something else entirely. He was afraid. I don't think I had a word for it when I was young, but that's what it was. On moonless nights, my grandfather was a man in the grip of a real, grinding fear. He would check the locks more than once. He'd sit in the living room long after everyone else went to bed. And come morning, he would look gray and hollowed out, like someone who had spent the night awake and watching for something that might or might not come. Some nights, despite that fan, I could hear things. The fan covered a lot, yes, but it didn't cover everything. And on certain nights, there were footsteps outside that house. They were slow footsteps pacing around, like someone circling something else, taking their time. It would move along one side of the house, pause, sometimes right outside our bedroom window, a pause long enough that I'd be holding my breath in bed, eyes open, seeing nothing because of those blackout blinds, thankfully, and then continue on around the next side. When I mentioned it at breakfast once, doing my best to sound casual about it, Grandma would smile and said that Grandpa had trouble sleeping and he liked to walk the property at night, said he was checking the animals in the barn to make sure nothing was getting into the feed. Parker, who was old enough by then to hear an explanation and measure it against what he actually believed, asked what exactly Grandpa was searching or checking for. Grandma changed the subject so smoothly, it was almost a magic trick, and before we knew it, we were talking about what we wanted for lunch. One night, I remember getting up to use the bathroom. I think I was 10 years old. The hallway was dark and the bathroom was on the far side of the living room, which meant I had to walk through the main part of the house to get there. As I passed through the living room, I stopped. Grandpa was in his recliner. The TV was off. Every light in the house was off. He was sitting perfectly upright with his deer rifle laid across his thighs, and his eyes were open, and he was staring at the front door. He didn't look at me. He didn't move. He did not acknowledge me in any way. He sat there like a man who had been sitting there for hours, and intended to sit there for hours more, watching that door with deadly focus, as if he expected it, or prayed that it wouldn't open. I went back to bed, and I listened to the fan and the footsteps outside, and I did not go back to sleep for a long time. The last thing I need to mention before I get to the rest of this is the basement. During the day, the basement was fair game. It was an unfinished space with concrete floor, cinder block walls, exposed ceiling joints, and it held the washer and dryer, a bunch of storage shelves, and a workbench Grandpa used for small projects. It had these narrow slit windows that sit at ground level from the outside, wider than they are tall, hinged at the top so they could swing inward for ventilation. During the day, Grandpa sometimes propped them up to air out the place. After dark, the basement, though, was off limits, and the way Grandpa communicated this was different from his other rules. Those other rules, the blinds, the fans, the inside before stars rule, those were enforced through routine. He just did them and you fell in line because that's how things worked. The basement rule was the only one he ever stated out loud, directly, looking right at us. He said, "You do not go in that basement after the sun goes down." And his face when he said it was not the face of a man setting a household boundary, but rather someone telling you not to put your hand into a running engine. He was not making a rule as much as he was describing a very real danger. For years, that's what summers were. The days were creek water and crawdads and the smell of cut grass and Grandma's fantastic cooking. But the nights were blackout blinds, locked doors, the drone of a box fan drowning out whatever moved in the dark outside. I accepted all of this. I was a kid. It was part of my world. Like Santa Claus, you accepted these kinds of things without analysis. This was Grandpa's house, and these were Grandpa's rules, and the world at Grandpa's house simply worked differently than it did at home. So I never really questioned it, and I followed every rule to the letter, right up until the summer I turned 11. That was the summer Grandpa had his stroke, when the rules came apart, and I finally truly learned what all of it had been for. Now, I know I said the last thing I would mention before the real story would be the basement thing, but there is one more thing I need to tell you before I get to what happened the summer I was 11. This is the story my grandfather told me on the porch. I was around 9 or 10. It was a full moon night. I remember that because the moon was the reason I was outside at all. I couldn't sleep despite the fan, or maybe because of it. My throat felt like sandpaper and I needed some water. When I padded out to the kitchen to get some, I could see through the gap at the bottom of the living room blinds. The porch was lit up silver white, bright enough to read by, and the front door was open to the screen. Obviously, this was all very bizarre. Grandpa never left doors open at night, never had the blinds in a way we could peek through them. But there he was on the other side of the screen door, sitting in his rocker with a rifle across his knees, staring out at the yard and the tree line beyond it in all that cold moonlight. I pushed open the screen door and he looked at me. I expected him to tell me to go back to bed right away, but he didn't do that. He looked very tired. In fact, I'd never seen him so tired. And I want to say it wasn't like a sleepy kind of tired either. The man looked absolutely worn through, a tiredness that went beyond muscles. He studied me for a second, then he tipped his head toward the other rocking chair. I sat down in it with my feet dangling, because I was too short to reach the concrete. We sat there for a while without talking. The moon was so bright it threw hard shadows across the yard, and the tree line at the edge of the mowed grass looked like a wall someone had built out of pure blackness, but then backlit it from the inside with pale gray where the moonlight caught the upper canopy. It was beautiful enough to take your breath away. Every few seconds a bat would cut through the light above the yard, there and gone so quick it was like a glitch in your vision. Then Grandpa began to talk. He didn't look at me when he did, and he didn't raise his voice above a low murmur. It really looked like he was talking to himself rather than to me. He told me a story, and I'm going to relay it here the way I can remember it, which means it might have gaps or rough edges, because I was a child then when I heard it, and he was not a man who knew how to tell a story in any organized fashion. He was blunt and sparse, with a lot left out that he either assumed you'd fill in or preferred you didn't. So here goes. When my grandfather was young, 20 or 21, he said, something had started getting into the livestock on the properties around his family's land. His father, my great-grandfather, raised cattle, and a few of the neighboring families had cattle or hogs or both. Over the span of maybe a month, animals started to turn up dead in the fields and pens, and from the way Grandpa described it, dead was putting it generously. He said the animals were taken apart. He used that phrase specifically. Taken apart. Like a mechanic taking apart an engine. Pieces here, pieces there. Organs separated from the body and moved to places they shouldn't be. He said one of the neighbor's heifers was found with its rib cage opened up and emptied out, with the contents arranged in the grass beside it, in what he called a kind of order, though he wouldn't say what that meant, and I wasn't asking. I remember thinking, how is he telling a kid my age all of this? But he kept going. The initial assumption was dogs. Feral dogs were a real problem in that part of the Ozarks. Packs of them could form up out of strays and dumped pets. They could bring down a calf if they were hungry and numerous enough. But the men who looked at the remains said it wasn't dogs, and it wasn't coyotes either. Because dogs and coyotes are messy, frantic killers that tear into whatever they can reach and leave a scattered wreck. Whatever was doing this, it was doing it with a kind of deliberateness, and that did not match any predator that they knew of. Grandpa said his father came back from examining one of the kills and sat at the kitchen table, completely silent. When Grandpa's mother asked him what was wrong, he simply said, "Something's pulling them apart with its hands." Now, nobody called the game warden or the sheriff. This was the rural Ozarks in the early 1950s. These men solved their own problems. My great-grandfather organized a hunt. He put the word out to the surrounding families. Grandpa's Uncle Earl 2 men from the next property over whose names I've long forgotten, or maybe I never knew, and a cousin of some kind, who I think was only there mostly because he owned dogs that had been used for tracking boar. In total, there were 5, maybe 6 men, including my grandfather, who was the youngest at the time, and was allowed to come because he owned a rifle too, and knew how to use it, and because his father was not the kind of man you argued with successfully. They went out on a night when the livestock killings had been at their worst. Grandpa said they waited for the moon to be up so they'd have light. They brought rifles and lanterns and the tracking dogs, 2 of them, big bony hounds with scarred up ears, and they went into the trees behind my great-grandfather's property at around 10 o'clock at night. Grandpa told me about this part of the hunt in pieces, and some of what he said I've had to reconstruct from what I remember, and what makes sense in context. Because, like I said, he was not a natural storyteller, and I was a kid, sitting in the dark, trying to follow an old man's fragmented account of something that happened 40 years before I was born. The dogs lasted about an hour. They went in eager, excited hounds with a scent to follow, heads down and pulling against their leads. But then they stopped, both of them, at nearly the same time. They froze where they stood and began shaking. Grandpa said one of them urinated on itself. They refused to move forward, and they refused to stay quiet. They started to make a sound that he described as a continuous whine, high and thin. Not a game call, but something from when it's gone beyond fear into a place where its brain had stopped working properly. One of the dogs ripped free of its lead and bolted off. They heard it crashing through the underbrush for about 30 seconds, and then the sound faded and they never found that dog. The remaining hound pressed itself against its owner's legs and had to be dragged along for the rest of the night, like a piece of furniture. So after the dogs became useless, the men kept going on their own. They were deep in the timber by this point, and that old-growth Ozark woodland, where the canopy closes overhead and the moonlight comes through in patches. Everything between those patches is ink dark. Grandpa said they could hear something moving in the trees around them. He was specific about this part. He said it wasn't moving through the underbrush like a deer or a boar would, pushing through branches at ground level. It was moving above them, in the canopy. He said they could hear branches creaking and snapping up high, the sound of something heavy transferring its weight from limb to limb, and it was fast, much faster than walking pace. He said it circled them for a while, up there in the dark above the lantern light, and the sound of it was like a man running on all fours across treetops, which is an image I've never been able to get out of my head, even though I heard this sitting on a porch 20-some years ago. They kept moving because they were men who had committed to doing something, and because turning back now would have meant walking through the same stretch of forest they had just come through, and whatever was pacing them in the canopy would have still been there. Grandpa said they walked for maybe another half hour, with the sound above them coming and going, sometimes close enough that debris would fall on them, small twigs and bark and pieces of leaf, other times far enough away that they nearly convinced themselves it had gone. The remaining dog had given up walking entirely and was being carried by its owner. Then, the thing came down out of the trees. Grandpa didn't describe this like a dramatic moment. He said it matter-of-factly, like someone saying it started to rain. The crashing above them stopped, and there was a heavy sound about 40 yards ahead of them, like something landing on the ground from a great height. Then, silence. It was Uncle Earl who saw it first. Earl was at the front of the group, a few paces ahead of the others, carrying a lantern in one hand and his rifle in the other. He stopped walking and said very low without turning around, "It's standing up." Grandpa raised his lantern. At the far edge of the light, about 30 yards out where the glow gave way to solid dark, he could see a shape between two trees. He said it was tall, taller than any of them, and Earl was over 6 feet. It was standing on 2 legs, and it was perfectly still. The lantern light was too weak at that distance to give him anything more than an outline, but he said the outline was enough. He said it looked like someone had taken the general idea of a person and built it after stretching the measurements. He said the head set forward on the neck, reminding him more of a vulture, with a long-looking snout or perhaps a nose, and its shoulders were enormous, far too wide for the head they supported. The arms hung past where arms should stop. Then it dropped forward onto all 4s, and it was gone. The sound of its movement exploded back into the canopy above them, crashing through the branches heading north, fast and getting farther away. The men stood there in a circle of lantern light with their rifles up, and nobody said anything for what Grandpa estimated was about 2 full minutes. They should have gone home. They all knew that. But they didn't, because Uncle Earl said the thing was heading toward the Dawson property, where cattle had been killed the week prior. And because these were Ozark men in the 1950s, and going home would have been something they'd have to live with for a long time, they followed. The timber got worse as they went north. The terrain broke up into ridges and draws and rocky shelves where the footing was bad even in daylight, and the men started to spread out because you couldn't walk 6 abreast through that kind of country. They kept in contact by calling to each other. Grandpa said his father would shout, and the others would shout back, a kind of roll call every few minutes to make sure nobody had fallen or gotten turned around. The thing in the canopy had gone quiet, or at least they couldn't hear it over the sound of their own movement across the rough ground. Suddenly, there was a gunshot, a single sharp crack that bounced off the ridge walls and came from the east, from Uncle Earl's direction, because Earl had drifted the furthest from the group. Grandpa said everyone stopped where they were, and in the silence after the shot, they heard Earl screaming. He was far enough away that the sound was thin and echoing and hard to locate precisely. But it was unmistakably a man screaming in a register that Grandpa said he'd never heard from a grown person before, and never heard again after. Then there was a second shot, which cut off the screaming. Then nothing. Just the trees in the dark, and all of them standing in it. For some time, Grandpa went quiet after he told me that part. He rocked in his chair and looked at the moon, and his hands were still on the rifle across his lap. I could see that even decades later, the memory of that silence after the second shot was costing him something to sit with. I waited because even at 9 or 10, I understood that you don't interrupt a man when he's in a place like that. When he started again, his voice was flatter. He said they'd found Earl's rifle at the bottom of a draw, wedged between 2 rocks. It had been fired twice, both rounds spent. There was blood on the rocks and on the ground, a lot of it, and there were drag marks leading down into a ravine so choked with brush and fallen timber that they couldn't push through it in the dark. They stood at the edge of that ravine, calling Earl's name until the sky started to lighten up in the east. My grandfather didn't tell me what they found when they went back in daylight. He said, "They told his wife it was an animal attack." I noticed that phrasing even then, young as I was. They told her. He didn't say it was an animal attack. He told me what they told her it was, and the gap between those 2 things was wide enough to fall into. The official family story, the one I'd heard at Thanksgiving tables and funerals my whole life, without knowing it had any connection to my grandfather's property, was that Earl had died in a hunting accident, had shot himself, and by the time the search party had reached him, animals had gotten to the remains. A tragedy, but the kind of tragedy that happened in the rural Ozarks. People accepted it because it was the kind of thing that could be accepted. Grandpa sat with me for a while longer after he finished. The moon had moved since he'd started talking, and the shadows in the yard had shifted with it. The tree line looked different than before. Not to say it was menacing, exactly, but more aware. Like when you walk in a room and you didn't know that someone was in there and they never announce themselves. You simply see them suddenly. Eventually, he looked at me, and his eyes were clear and direct. He said, "There's something in those woods that doesn't have a name, and it's smarter than you want it to be. That's why we have the rules. You understand?" I nodded. "The worst nights are the new moons," he said. "On a full moon, you can see it coming. On a new moon, it can see you, and you can't see a thing." He told me to go back to bed then, and I went. I pulled the sheet up to my nose, and I listened to the box fan roar. But I did not go back to sleep that night. In the morning, I looked out the window at the tree line in the early sunlight. It was just trees, the very same trees I'd played under the day before. But now they meant something completely different. After that night on the porch, I never doubted or wondered about the rules again. I would pull the blinds down myself, turn the fan on before anyone told me to, and I would be the first inside before the first star even showed, every single time without being asked. The footsteps outside some nights that Grandma said were Grandpa checking on the animals. I knew what those were now. My grandfather was not inspecting the barn. Grandpa wasn't even outside. Something in those woods had taken my grandfather's uncle apart in a ravine 40 years ago, and it was still here. I understood the rules. I followed the rules, and those rules kept us safe every summer of my childhood, until the summer my grandfather collapsed in his kitchen with a mug of coffee shattering on the linoleum and the left side of his body going slack. Suddenly, the only person who truly knew what the rules were for was unconscious and driven to a hospital. Grandpa's stroke happened one morning in the middle of our second week during that stay. He was standing at the counter pouring coffee from the percolator, the same thing he did every morning at the same time, and his left hand simply opened on its own and let the mug fall. It hit the floor, breaking into 3 pieces, and coffee went everywhere. Grandpa looked down at it, then looked at Grandma, and said, "Joyce, there's something wrong with my arm." Then he sat down in a kitchen chair heavily, like someone had increased the gravity in the room, and the left side of his face slid downward and stayed there. Grandma called 911. She called Aunt Diane too, who lived 4 hours away in the suburbs outside St. Louis. Then she did what she could, which was to hold Grandpa's right hand and talk to him in a steady voice while the 3 of us stood in the kitchen doorway, watching, not knowing what to do with ourselves. I remember that the ambulance took a long time to get there. That's how far out we were from anything. They loaded Grandpa onto a stretcher. He looked so small and frail. I remember thinking that my grandpa might die, and I was scared. This man, who had been the largest presence in every room he ever entered, now looked like a gray-faced old man with only one working hand. Grandma couldn't go with him, not until Aunt Diane came, and once Aunt Diane showed up, Grandma left in a hurry. I remember just after she left, looking at the blinds on the windows, thinking that no one in this house would know to pull them down, and why. Aunt Diane and her husband Cal arrived around 3 in the afternoon, hugging Grandma and wishing her and Grandpa the best as she left. Aunt Diane was Grandpa's youngest daughter, a very sweet woman with a loud laugh who worked as an office manager somewhere. She drove a minivan and had probably not spent a full night in this house in 15 years. Uncle Cal was fine, a big, soft-spoken guy who sold insurance and was decent with kids. He gave lots of those cheesy kid compliments and high fives, like, "Good job, sport," that kind of thing. They were the kind of adults you'd want around during a family emergency, for sure. Warm and capable. Aunt Diane spent most of the evening on the phone with the hospital and with other relatives, leading a sort of crisis management with the family. Uncle Cal ordered pizza from the one place that would actually deliver that far out, which took over an hour. He even let us eat it in the living room in front of the TV, which Grandma never allowed. That first evening, I kept waiting for someone to start the routine, hoping someone was watching the sky and would call us inside if we were outside, or go room to room with the blinds, setting up fans, locking doors. But nobody did. The sun went down and the windows stayed uncovered, and the doors stayed latched with their regular locks, not with the deadbolts. No chain, no barrel bolt, nothing. The fans stayed in the closet where Grandma stored them during the day. That house felt utterly naked, like a body without skin. Everything that was supposed to be protected was now open and exposed to whatever was out there. I almost said something. I stood in the hallway and rehearsed it in my head. Something about how Grandpa liked the blinds down and the fans on. Something casual that wouldn't require me to explain why. But I couldn't figure out how to say it without sounding strange. I was 11 years old, but the weight of adult attention during a crisis was paralyzing, so I didn't say anything. I went to bed in the guest room with Parker and Leia. The window was uncovered, and the fan was off. I lay there in the most awkward silence, so enormous and wrong, I could hear my own heartbeat. I slept eventually. The following day was almost normal. Uncle Cal took us outside. We rode the three-wheeler and threw rocks in the creek, and Aunt Diane drove to the hospital, coming back in the late afternoon with a cautiously optimistic report. Grandpa was stable, responsive, but they were keeping him for observation and tests. There was also talk of moving him to a larger facility in Springfield. She looked exhausted. Uncle Cal made spaghetti for dinner. It was watery and undersalted, but we all ate it. Nobody had the energy to care about food quality at the time. That evening, Parker pulled me and Leia aside in the hallway. I could tell he was being very sneaky about something. "They don't care what we do," he said, meaning Aunt Diane and Uncle Cal, who were back on the phone in the master bedroom with the door mostly shut. "We should stay outside tonight, after dark. We're never going to get that chance again." Leia looked at me. I could tell she wanted me to say no so she wouldn't have to. And I nearly did. But Parker was 13 and I was 11. At that age, that's a big gap. And some part of me, the side that was tired of being so afraid every summer, tired of the fans and the blinds and the locked-down feeling of Grandpa's nighttime house, that side wanted to know what the property was like after dark. I'd spent years sealed inside while the world outside continued without me, and I wanted to see it. So I said okay, and Leia said okay because I had, and Parker grinned. We went out the back door at around 8:30, with the sky still holding on to the last orange glow in the west, but the east had already gone to deep blue. The very first thing that struck me was how different the property sounded at night. The creek, which was a pleasant background murmur during the day, was loud, more present, so to speak, in the dark, even aggressive sounding. The bugs were deafening, a whole wall of sound from every direction, cicadas and crickets and tree frogs layering over each other in a pulsing roar that seemed to breathe. And underneath all that was the woods. The tree line was about 60 yards from where we stood at the back of the house, and in the dying light, it looked solid, a dark mass without depth or detail. We had flashlights, 2 of them, from the kitchen junk drawer, but both were so weak that they barely reached 20 feet. Parker swept his across the yard like a searchlight. It revealed a narrow cone of grass and bugs, but nothing more. Beyond that cone was just more dark. He started to walk toward the tree line. Leia and I followed, too scared to be away from our oldest member. For about 20 minutes, it was what Parker had promised, an adventure. We walked along the edge of the trees without going in, shining our flashlights into the first few yards of timber, seeing trunks and underbrush. Occasionally, we found a pair of tiny reflective eyes, probably belonging to some small or low-to-the-ground raccoon or possum. Parker kept up a running commentary during this, about how this wasn't even scary, and that Grandpa's rules were just an old man being paranoid. I let him say those things because I simply didn't know what to say, and I liked the lack of silence. Suddenly, Leia stopped. She was slightly behind me and to my left. When I turned around, she was standing very still with her flashlight pointed at the tree line, about 40 yards south of where we were. Her flashlight was weak, and it barely reached the trees at that distance. But at the very edge of its throw, where the light gave up and the dark took over again, there was a shape between 2 trunks that I could not make sense of. It was taller than any of us by a significant margin. It was also narrow, standing on 2 legs, but it was completely motionless. The flashlight was much too dim to give any texture or color, so it remained a silhouette, a vertical interruption in the pattern of the trees behind it, and it was facing us. "Something standing there," Leia said. Her voice was perfectly calm. Parker swung his flashlight toward it. For half a second, both beams hit roughly the same area, and in that combined light, I saw, or I thought I saw, the shape shift, a sudden movement, quickly, like something rearranging its posture. Leia's light flickered then. These were cheap, battery-powered flashlights. In that half-second of reduced light, the shape was gone. Just trees. Just ordinary dark between tree trunks. Parker said it was a deer. He said it with enough conviction that I knew he didn't believe it. And I think Leia knew too, because she was already walking toward the house, and she was walking fast. We followed her, and how we kept from actually full-on running, I have no idea. Perhaps we were too scared to run, but we walked at a pace that was as close to running as you could get. And when we made it to the back door and went inside, shutting it behind us, Parker locked the knob lock and then stood there looking at the deadbolt above it. He looks at us, then half laughs, saying, "It'll be fine." So we left it unlocked, and we didn't say anything else about it. We stood in the kitchen, breathing harder than the walk justified, and Parker then said, "That was fun." But Leia and I stayed quiet. He then said, "We should sleep down in the basement tonight." I felt my stomach drop when he said it. The basement was the other rule, the one Grandpa had spoken out loud with his eyes locked on mine, and hearing Parker propose breaking it felt like hearing someone suggest swimming in a river during a storm. But Parker was already talking about it like it was decided. He'd seen the old Nintendo down there, he said, when Aunt Diane had gone down to do laundry earlier. And there were games, and probably other stuff. And the basement was cool, and it would be like a fort. And he reiterated, when would we get another chance? I looked at Leia. She had her arms crossed over her chest, and she was staring at the floor. We were both wondering the same thing, I think. How much resistance was worth the cost of Parker's ridicule? She must have arrived at the same answer I did, because she shrugged one shoulder and said, "Whatever." And Parker took that as unanimous consent and started gathering supplies. We brought sleeping bags and pillows from the guest room. Parker grabbed a bag of chips and 3 cans of Coke from the fridge. Leia brought a book, which was optimistic. We trooped down the wooden stairs into the basement, and Parker pulled the chain on the single bare bulb at the bottom. The room came to life in harsh yellowish light. Everything else was concrete and shadow. Honestly, for a few hours though, it was great. Parker found the NES under the workbench, still connected to a small TV that must have been old when Reagan was president, and after 20 minutes of blowing into cartridges and fiddling with the AV cables, he got it to work. We played Excitebike, then Duck Hunt without the light gun, just using the controller, which didn't work perfectly, but we didn't mind. Leia found a stack of board games on a shelf, Sorry and Clue and something called Aggravation that none of us had ever heard of. We played Clue on the concrete floor with the chips and soda spread around us, like we were having a picnic. Parker discovered a cabinet near the water heater that contained, among other things, a collection of candy so old that some of it was in packaging I didn't recognize. We tried a few pieces. They tasted like sweetened chalk. We ate them anyway, because adventure was the whole point. Really, it was the most fun I'd had at that house in years, maybe ever. We were loud and stupid and free, and Aunt Diane and Uncle Cal never came down to check on us. For those few hours, the basement was just a basement, and the rules we were used to, they were just the eccentricities of an old man who was currently in a hospital bed 40 minutes away, with tubes in his arm. We fell asleep in stages. Leia went first. She had set up her sleeping bag near the base of the stairs, and was out cold by midnight. Parker lasted a little longer on the sagging couch against the far wall, talking to me about a girl from his school, while his sentences got slower and more fragmented, until they stopped entirely, and his breathing evened out. I lay in my sleeping bag in the middle of the floor. I was between the two of them, looking up at the ceiling joists and the cobwebs, listening to the silence. No fan, just silence. I hadn't really thought about that part until that very moment. I'd been distracted by the games and the food and the novelty of it all. But lying there in the dark after Parker killed the light, the silence of that basement was absolute. No fan roar to fill the space, and no white noise to blur the edges of whatever sounds the night might be making. There was, though, the faint ticking of the water heater, and the even fainter hum of the electrical panel on the wall. But beyond that, nothing. I listened to my cousin's breathing. It was so dark and so quiet. It felt like I was deep, deep underwater. Eventually, and I don't know when, I fell asleep. But when I woke up, I was very cold. Genuinely cold. A damp chill had gotten through the sleeping bag and into my skin. It made no sense because it was July in Missouri, and the basement had been stuffy and warm when we'd come down. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around myself. That's when I felt the draft. Moving air coming from somewhere to my left, carrying a smell that did not belong in that basement. The green, wet smell of outside, of grass and dirt and night air, and underneath it was something else. A warm and sour and biological smell. It reminded me of a dog's breath, but heavier and denser, more concentrated. One of the slit windows was open. I couldn't see it. I couldn't see it. The dark in that basement was the most complete dark I'd ever experienced, where open and closed eyes were the same thing. But I could feel the outside air coming through it. I could feel that the air was wrong, that it carried the heat and smell of something that was not the night. And every hair on my body stood up at once. I heard it before I could even make sense of it. Breathing. Low and wet, raspy on the exhale. A large animal trying to keep quiet. Something was in the room with us. Something was inside the basement, and it was breathing. It was close. I stopped moving, and I stopped breathing. Every muscle in my body locked into a rigid, frozen state that I did not choose and could not have overridden if I'd tried. My higher brain, the part that reasons and plans and makes decisions, had been disconnected from the controls entirely, and what was running me now was something much older, much simpler. Something that said to me, "You must not move. You must not breathe. You must no longer exist." The breathing shifted. It moved through the room, slowly, with a carefulness that was worse than speed, because speed would mean a panicked animal, and this was not panicked. It was methodical. And beneath that breathing, accompanying it, I heard the footsteps, a light, clicking, tapping cadence on the concrete floor. The sound of something with claws, walking on a hard surface, and the rhythm. It didn't match anything that walks on two legs, but it didn't quite match anything that walks on four. The sound of it moving across the concrete floor in the perfect dark was the most alien and dislocating thing I've ever heard. It moved past me, close enough that I could feel warmth coming off of it, the radiant body heat of something large and very alive, and I caught a wave of that smell, that sour, biological, overly wet dog smell. But up close, it was sharper, and there was more underneath it, something that reminded me of blood. It passed within what had to be 2 or 3 feet of my sleeping bag, and I lay there with my eyes wide open in the dark, and I saw absolutely nothing. I felt it go by me, like a weather system. Then it stopped, near the couch where Parker had been sleeping. I heard the breathing change then, faster, shorter, with a sniffing quality, like it was sampling the air around him. Then it moved again, toward the stairs, toward Leia. It stopped. The breathing was maybe 4 feet from my head, 4 feet from Leia's sleeping bag at the base of the stairs. I could hear her slow, unconscious breathing, and the thing's breathing layered over it, and for a span of time that I cannot accurately estimate. Was it 5 seconds, 30, a full minute? Those were the only sounds in the world. Then the thing made a sound, a low and soft sound from deep in its chest, barely louder than the breathing. It wasn't a growl, and it wasn't a whine. It sat somewhere between the two, carrying an emotion I should not have been able to read, but I could. It was interested. Whatever was standing over my cousin in the dark was curious about her. Leia shifted in her sleeping bag, a small unconscious movement, the kind of half-roll that sleeping people do, and she made a sound, a murmur, maybe a fragment of a dream, nothing coherent. But then her eyes opened. No, I couldn't see it. I knew because she spoke then. Her voice was muzzy and confused and half asleep, and I heard her say, "Is that a dog? Who let a—" The rest of her sentence was replaced by a sound that I will hear for the rest of my life. A sudden detonation of movement, claws scrabbling on concrete, a heavy, wet impact of a body hitting the sleeping bag, and the sound of the bag being seized and wrenched sideways across the floor so quickly that Leia's confused question turned into a scream that did not sound like language or even a human voice anymore. Just a raw and primal shriek of an animal in terror. It bounced off the concrete walls, filling the basement from floor to ceiling. I heard the sleeping bag dragging, fast, impossibly fast, scraping across the concrete toward the far wall where the open window was. Trust me, I would soon know where that open window was exactly. I could hear Leia thrashing about inside the sleeping bag. The thing had hold of the outside of it and was pulling her. I could hear the fabric tearing in long, ripping sounds as claws and teeth shredded through the outer shell. Parker was screaming from the couch. "What's happening?" And somewhere above us, through the ceiling, I heard the concussive thud of adult feet hitting the floor and running. The dragging reached the wall, and there was a different sound. The sleeping bag being hauled upward, lifted off the ground toward the slit window. The window frame groaned. Leia was screaming in short, breathless bursts, and I could hear the fabric of the sleeping bag catching at the edges of the window, tearing further. I understood, with a sick, lurching horror, that whatever had her was trying to pull her through that window. An 18-inch wide slit window, 4 feet off the basement floor on the inside, but ground level on the outside. Something out there was hauling a child in a sleeping bag up the wall, attempting to drag her through it with the disturbing strength of something I don't want to share a world with. The basement light suddenly came on. Aunt Diane had hit the switch at the top of the stairs, and the bare bulb exploded the room back into existence. Every detail was harsh and yellow again, and suddenly, violently real. I saw the basement, the scattered sleeping bags and the crushed chip bag, the Ness still connected to the silent TV. Parker was now standing on top of the couch, his back against the wall. His face was white and his mouth was wide open. His hands were up near his chest like he was bracing for a hit. And across the room, against the far wall, there was Leia's sleeping bag, hanging. The top half was wedged into the open slit window, pulled upward and bunched into the narrow frame. The bottom half hung down the wall, limp, with Leia's weight inside it, sagging toward the floor. The bag was shredded in long lines, 4 slashes evenly spaced across, and through the tears I could see the color of Leia's pajamas and even the skin of her arm. She wasn't moving or screaming anymore. She had gone silent, so absolutely terrified she'd stopped moving. Then the bag dropped. Whatever had been holding it from outside released it all at once, and Leia and the sleeping bag collapsed to the basement floor in a heap. From outside the window, inches away, just on the other side of that ground-level slit, I heard something move, a single heavy thud, the sound of a large animal pushing off the grass, heading back for the tree line, leaving us there in the aftermath. Uncle Cal came down the stairs 3 at a time, his face aghast. He grabbed Leia off the floor, sleeping bag and all, and carried her rapidly up the stairs. Aunt Diane was behind him, one hand on the wall, the other over her mouth, asking questions. Parker scrambled off the couch and ran for the stairs. I saw him glancing at the still open window several times as he did. I was the last one up. As I reached the bottom step, I too turned and looked back at that window. It was still open, swinging slightly inward on its hinge. Beyond it, through the narrow rectangle of the opening, I could see a strip of the yard due to the light that spilled out from the basement. There was grass, the first few feet of ground outside, and at the edge of the light already pulling back into the dark, there was a pair of eyes. They were low to the ground and caught the basement light like an animal's. A yellow reflective shine. They were close together, but that's all I could see due to the dark. They looked at me for less than a second, but then they were gone. and I swear I could hear the sound of something moving fast through the woods. I ran up the stairs, and I didn't go back down. Leia was physically fine. There were some light scratches from the window frame on her arms and shoulders, a bruise across her ribs where she'd been pinned inside the sleeping bag as it was pulled against the narrow opening. But nothing was broken, nothing that would leave a scar on the outside. Uncle Cal went out with a flashlight, walking the perimeter of the house, while Aunt Diane sat with us in the living room with every light on. Uncle Cal came back about 15 minutes later, said he couldn't find a thing. He started to explain it. It was a bear, he said, attracted to the smell of the food we'd brought down there. And I could see in his face that he was constructing something that he could believe, not something that was currently true, but something that would become true. There was no more sleep to be had that night. We stayed up in the living room together until dawn, with the TV on and the volume up, every light on in the house. Leia sat in the corner of the couch with her knees pulled to her chest and did not speak, nor would she speak in the morning or the morning after that, and she would not talk to me or the rest of us for the remainder of that summer. Aunt Diane called the hospital that night. She was in the kitchen and she was keeping her voice low, but I was in the hallway and I heard most of it. She described what happened. She used the word animal several times and the word window several more. When she stopped, there was some silence, long enough that Aunt Diane said, "Mom, are you there?" But then my grandmother's voice came through, and I could hear what she asked. She had said, "Were the windows closed?" That was her first question. Not if Leia was okay, or what happened, but about the windows. It was like she knew exactly what would have happened if the windows were not locked, or if someone had gone down into the basement where the windows didn't lock. Grandma, like Grandpa, probably knew what was out there, but did not have the first-hand experience like Grandpa had. Grandpa would not have forgotten to lock the place down. But Grandma, in a panic, well, I can't blame her. This was not her fault. I really can't say it was anyone's fault. We were driven home 2 days later. Our summer was over. I hope that makes you understand why the sound of a box fan brings me some sort of comfort, or security might be a better word, because my mind has subconsciously associated things with that event. It knows that before the attack, there was box fan noise when we slept, but on the night of the attack, there was none. So until the day I die, there will be a box fan running full blast in my room, because I do not want to hear what's lurking outside my window. What in the world was that? What kind of creature resembles a thin and sickly werewolf, but can fit through a thin window to drag away children? This story is going to give me nightmares for weeks to come. Good night. Thank you all so much for joining me on my podcast here, called Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. You can listen to and review Unexplained Encounters on your favorite podcast app, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts and so on. It's super helpful. You can find all my narrations on YouTube at Darkness Prevails. Until next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.